Chapter 101, The Three Main Forces of CP9. Robin's eyes narrowed as she sized up Kaku. This adversary was in a league far beyond the one she'd faced moments earlier. She'd been able to bend that first opponent's iron block with ease, but Kaku had warped it into something unrecognizable. Instantly, she sprang into action. Activating her Hana no Mi powers, dozens of flowered limbs burst from her body, vaulting her over a fallen beam at the alley's edge. In the blink of an eye, she vanished from view. Kaku didn't flinch. With a calm exhale, he kicked off the ground and unleashed Geppo, the moonwalk technique. He soared upward, leaped from wall to wall, and closed the distance in a heartbeat, locking onto Robin's trail. Realizing she couldn't outrun him, Robin planted her feet. She pivoted, crossed her arms before her chest, and curled her fingers into claws. 7 months of grueling training on that deserted island had transformed her. Her intellect now struck fear into foes, and her devil fruit mastery had deepened immeasurably. Around her, a storm of petals coalesced into dozens of massive arms. Like the claws of a giant, they whipped forward, snatching Kaku by the head and wrenching with savage force, determined to shatter his neck in one merciless motion. Robin had prepared for every contingency, and this was only her opening gambit. Kaku's expression flickered the moment he felt that binding force lock onto him. Even his iron gauntlets could only hold it back at the cost of jarring his muscles, just as Bruno had discovered the hard way. With a savage roar, he ripped free from the grasping arms and leapt into the air. His legs whipped out in a blur, 6, 7 powerful kicks slicing through the space toward Robin. But Robin's eyes were cool and unwavering. Reading each erratic arc in an instant, he pivoted on his slender waist and slipped cleanly past every strike. "Damn paper art!" Kaku snarled, momentarily stunned by Robin's agility. He surged forward, eager to grind things out at close quarters. Robin, however, had no mind for a brawl. With a stuttering wave of his arms, he unleashed his ability, an unseen current that snagged Kaku's footing. Off balance, Kaku stumbled, careening down the street and into the milling crowd beyond. "You're not getting away," Kaku growled, irritation flaring in his eyes. With reckless force, he plunged into the masses, scattering bystanders as he tore after Robin once more. Nethan sprinted down the narrow alley, every muscle straining as he chased Robin. He'd already been beaten back by street urchins and local thugs. He couldn't afford another failure. Desperate to close the gap, he activated his moonstep and burst upward in a flash of pale light, aiming a stunning aerial kick at her. But Robin was ready. She darted beneath his swing, caught his knee with a solid palm strike, and sent him crashing onto the cobblestones. Whoosh! Whoosh! Robin's senses blazed to life as she zigzagged between refuse bins and broken crates. Each movement was a blur. Nethan lunged after her, but she danced just out of reach, widening the distance between them. Just when Robin dared to think she'd lost him, a sudden rush of wind whipped past her ear. A single finger shot toward her like a bullet. Navy 6 finger gun, its force whistling through the air. Anticipating the strike, Robin arched her back in an almost impossible curve, letting the blast graze beneath her chin. She landed lightly on both feet, the flexibility of her slender frame absorbing the attack. But her relief was brief. As she turned, she saw more figures emerging from the shadows. Bruno had been her first adversary. Now at least 2 more were closing in, tightening the circle around her. Gabra leveled a finger gun at Nethan's back, but didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he chuckled at Kaku, who was rushing in from behind. "Hey, Kaku, you almost let him slip away," Gabra teased. "You really need to work on your timing." Kaku skidded to a halt beside him, eyes blazing. "Shut up! I got him, didn't I? If I'd waited 1 second longer, he'd be gone for good. Notice any difference?" Gabra merely snorted and crossed his arms. Kaku bristled, and for a tense moment they seemed ready to argue again. Nethan took advantage of their distraction, glancing over his shoulder and pressing back into the jostling crowd. He inched sideways, trying to melt into the chaos and make his escape. But before he could move more than a few paces, a calm voice rose behind him. "That's enough, both of you." Lucci stepped out of the throng, his gaze sweeping from Kaku to Gabra. "Catching the Devil's Son is only part of this assignment. We have bigger concerns right now." Kaku and Gabra exchanged one last glare but fell silent. The 2 agents formed a rough triangle, with Nethan trapped in the center. He realized, with a sinking heart, that there was nowhere left to run. Lucci glanced at Kaku. "Did you bring the Hailu stone shackles?" Kaku shook his head. "They're still at Owl's place. I've sent word. He'll bring them as soon as he can." Lucci nodded coolly, then turned his eyes back to Robin. "Let me give you one piece of advice. We've been ordered to take you alive, but that doesn't mean you'll walk away unscathed." Robin froze, her arms suspended halfway through a gesture. She ground her teeth, flexed her fingers, and then smoothly crossed her arms, knuckles cracking. 30 Blossom Barrage, finger guns! Before she could complete the attack, Lucci sprang forward. His right index finger shot out like a speeding bullet, wrapped in howling wind as it aimed straight for her. Robin spun sideways, abandoning her own assault to dodge. "Dodge, finger gun, scarlet flame," she spat. But Lucci's expression never changed. His arm blurred into an afterimage, then flickered back into focus as his finger jabbed out again and again. In the space of a heartbeat, a dozen wind-pierced shots streaked toward Robin, each one intent on cutting off any chance of escape. Robin tapped into her haki, sharpening her sight and hearing to anticipate Lucci's next move. In that decisive moment, she twisted her slender waist and wove through his relentless fingergun blasts. Despite her heightened senses, however, her reflexes still lagged behind Lucci's blistering speed. After dodging over a dozen shots in rapid succession, she could still track his attacks perfectly, but her body simply wouldn't obey. Then, without warning, the cobblestones beneath their feet shuddered violently. The tremor shot through the street, sending onlookers stumbling and forcing Lucci to interrupt his assault. He froze in mid-pose, finger guns trained on Robin, eyes wide. "CP9, a calm voice announced from the far end of the avenue. "Don't think you can pick off my crew when I'm not looking." Nethan emerged from the shadows, his expression unreadable as he strolled forward. He swept a cool, assessing glance over the scene, every step measured. He didn't need to raise a hand. His mere presence was enough to tell Robin and Lucci exactly who he was. Lucci's eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and indignation as Nethan's words hung in the air. The code name cracked open old wounds, and for a heartbeat, the finger guns wavered. The balance of power had shifted, and both combatants knew it. Under the world government's intelligence network, 10 bureaus operate in the shadows. 8, CP1 through CP8, are publicly acknowledged, but 2 remain hidden, CP9 and above it, CP0. Both secret agencies answer directly to the Celestial Dragons, and only the government's highest echelons and the Navy know of CP9's existence. Lucci stood in the middle of the now empty street. He didn't pursue Nico Robin. Instead, he turned coolly to the man who had just arrived, Nethan. The mission's first phase had fallen apart. They'd planned to capture Robin, then carry out a swift, surgical assassination to wipe the Ghost Hand pirates from the map with minimal collateral. Even if the assassination failed, Robin would still be a valuable hostage. But grabbing her had proven unexpectedly difficult, and precious time had slipped away. Still, the plan's collapse wasn't disastrous. The hit was always meant to be the cleanest option, but today's circumstances presented a different opportunity. Their main fighters, Kaku and Jabra, were already locked in battle. Subterfuge was no longer necessary. Lucci's eyes hardened. "Abort the covert strike," he ordered. "We go in full force, eliminate the Ghost Hand pirates, and capture the Devil's Daughter, Nico Robin." Chapter 102, Rob Lucci, Ghost Hand Roads. "At last we meet," Rob Lucci said, his voice cool and detached. "More than 6 months ago, we were assigned to bring you in. Care to explain where you've been all this time?" Nethan Rhodes returned his stare with deliberate calm. "Why don't you tell me?" he replied, stepping toward Robin. He gave her a quick once-over, no cuts, no bruises, and then pivoted back to face Lucci and his partners. Lucci stood at the front, flanked by Kaku on his left and Jabura on his right. The three of them formed an unyielding line, their expressions unreadable. "I'm not interested in your excuses," Lucci continued, frost in his tone. "Your 6-month disappearance has put us dangerously behind schedule. We're running out of time." Nethan lifted his leather cap, examining it as if weighing his next words. "What a shame," he said quietly, "because this mission was destined to fail from the start." With a sharp flick of his fingers, he sent the cap soaring up to nestle atop a nearby lamppost. The street fell silent. On Nethan's left stood Robin, poised and alert, On his right, Lafitte remained equally ready. Together, they faced the trio of Seaforpole agents in a tense standoff. Nathan leveled his gaze on Lucci. "I know everything about you," he added, his voice low but unwavering. Nathan barely had time to draw a breath before Lucci's cold voice cut through the night air. "I regret how things have unfolded," he said, "but you defied the world government and tried to assassinate its naval officers. There's no denying your guilt." Without warning, Lucci reached behind his back and ripped away the camo cloak he'd been wearing. The fabric tore easily, exposing a skin-tight black windbreaker that hugged every sinew of his frame. He fixed Nathan with an unblinking stare. "No matter how vicious you claim to be," Lucci continued, "a handful of pirates still can't match the full might of the government." Before Nathan could react, Lucci seemed to vanish. One moment he was 10 paces away, the next he thundered straight at Nathan like a bolt of dark lightning. His boot connected with Nathan's chest in a single, brutal motion, so fast and so powerful that the air itself ripped around his foot in a blade-like arc. Blood blossomed across Nathan's shirt, and he staggered back into Lafitte and Robin, who were standing just behind him. The kick's shockwave flattened loose barrels and sent splinters flying. It was a strike born of years of disciplined training. Yet, according to the stories, Lucci and his men had lain low for nearly 5 years, keeping their true strength submerged. And here tonight, with almost 9 years still remaining before Luffy even set sail, they just demonstrated just how fearsome that hidden power could be. Nathan swallowed a sharp gasp of pain, braced himself, and glared up at Lucci. The pirates' crew might be outnumbered and outgunned, but they weren't finished fighting yet. Rhodes sensed that his current strength was virtually unchanged from what he remembered. A sharp whistle tore through the air as Lafitte and Robin reacted in an instant, diving off to the side and the rear. Nathan, by contrast, didn't budge. He planted his feet, lifted his right hand with casual confidence, and snatched the invisible slash, an attack powerful enough to shear through an entire building, right out of the void. There was a sizzling crack as the blade met Nathan's palm, as if it had suddenly turned solid and was trying desperately to carve open his hand. Yet no matter how fiercely it fought, the slash couldn't advance an inch. Nathan held it fast, as though restraining a writhing serpent, then gave it a dismissive flick. The discarded attack struck a nearby tower, cleaving cleanly through its upper floors. In one swift motion, the top half of the building collapsed, smashing onto the street below with a thunderous roar that reverberated through the city. Nathan's voice was calm as he lowered his right hand, never once shifting his stance. "I don't know if you dare compare yourselves to the world government," he said, "but with just the 3 of you, you're not even worth calling our enemies." Lucci met his gaze coolly. "Big talk. Anyone can boast when they've got the numbers." In an instant, the agents sprang into action. Lucci barreled toward Rhodes, while Kaku and Gabra bickered over who would face which opponent. Kaku insisted on challenging Lafitte. He refused to spar with a woman, while Gabra, still smarting from having failed to catch Robin earlier, vowed to snatch her away and make Kaku pay for his mistake. Kaku drew his twin swords, determination hardening his features. "Devil Sheriff Lafitte," he growled, "I won't treat you as carelessly as I did Robin." "Ho ho," said Lafitte, spinning his mahogany cane between slender fingers, a faint, courteous smile tugging at his lips. "So the government's espionage agency really does have a secret branch called CP9. How intriguing. I look forward to discovering the extent of your unique talents." Nathan, a master of stealth and infiltration, had always been fascinated by the world government's shadowy enforcers, CP9. He'd made it his personal challenge to see just how formidable they really were. Across the open courtyard, Robin stood perfectly still, her face unreadable as she locked eyes with Jabra. She had no fear of taking on a CP9 member alone. Jabra smirked wickedly. "Let's see how long Kaku can chase after you," he taunted. "If he still can't catch you today, he'll never live it down." In that instant, an unspoken signal passed among the fighters. Like clockwork, Robin and Jabra lunged forward. Lafitte and Kaku soared into the fray. Nathan and Lucci charged at each other, 6 opponents moving in perfect sync. Earlier, Lucci's first blow had barely stirred Nathan. Recognizing that mere brute force wouldn't suffice, Lucci unleashed his true power without hesitation. His frame ballooned upward, muscles rippling until he towered over even the largest bystanders. A leopard's spots blossomed across his skin, and his fingertips sharpened into lethal claws. "Fauna, fauna, fruit! Leopard model!" Lucci bellowed, roaring as he hauled himself fully into his beast form, ready to test Nethin's limits. Among the countless mediocre devil fruits, the leopard zone ranks among the strongest in the animal category, second only to mythical and ancient zones. With a low, feral roar, Lucci suddenly leapt skyward, fully unleashing the power of his leopard form. His legs, honed like razor blades, slashed downward toward Nethin, gouging the earth beneath him. In an instant, a massive arc of energy, nearly 100 meters wide, tore through the street and hurtled straight at Nethin, a strike powerful enough to obliterate a warship in one blow. Kaku, Lafitte, and the others, caught off guard by the sheer force, barely managed to dive aside, retreating as chunks of pavement and concrete exploded around them. Robin watched, stunned, as a gaping chasm yawned where the street had been. She had underestimated Lucci's true level. He was far beyond what she'd first believed. To her left, Jabra let out a sly, jackal-like grin. Though he hated to admit it, Lucci was indeed the strongest among them, and more than that, he was the most formidable CP9 agent in a century. Chapter 103, Rhodes vs. Lucci. It was April in the 13th year of the Great Pirate Age. In the blink of an eye, a colossal slash tore through the street, gouging a ravine almost 100 meters long. Lucci hovered above it all, supported by the moonstep technique, his face impassive as he stared down at the devastation. Dust and debris swirled until, at last, the center of the chasm cleared, revealing Rhodes standing exactly where the blade had struck. The fissure fanned out in front of and behind him, yet the ground directly beneath his feet remained miraculously unbroken. At that moment, Rhodes, now known to his friends as Nethin, lifted one arm in a pretend grasping motion. As the dust settled around him, he slowly retracted it and looked up at the night sky. "A miscalculation," he admitted under his breath. The reason became clear. When Lucci's slash had collided with his palm, the sheer speed and breadth of the attack caused it to split apart at the point of contact. The blade's energy veered off to either side of Nethin's arm, carving deep gashes in the street like a whip striking around a nail. But the small patch of ground where Nethin stood remained untouched, a testament to his unorthodox defense. Nethin's airblade cracked apart the moment he tried to send it back. "You're stronger than the vice admiral I faced," he said coolly, "but I surpass you both." In the next instant, his form blurred and vanished, reappearing high above Lucci, and he drove his boot downward with blinding speed. Lucci's eyes narrowed in silent challenge. He refused to dodge. Boom! Their feet crashed together in midair. Lucci's kick, wreathed in howling wind, poured every ounce of his leopard form strength into a single crushing strike. Physically, the beastly power of his muscles exceeded Nethin's, but Nethin wielded something far more dangerous than raw brawn: his devil fruit ability. The two forces collided with earth-shaking violence, sending shockwaves roaring outward for miles. Even those who had already fled onto adjacent streets trembled as rooftops rattled and windows cracked. "Is it an earthquake?" someone gasped. "No, it's a fight," another cried. What kind of battle could make the whole neighborhood quake? Panic spread instantly. Horrified by the relentless thunder of impacts, the onlookers scattered, desperate to put as much distance as they could between themselves and the titanic combatants. The deafening boom forced everyone to clamp their hands over their ears. Moments later, the dust cleared to reveal that Nethin and Lucci's energies had collided, and Nethin's twisting force had prevailed. Lucci, unable to maintain his aerial hold, plummeted like a blazing meteor and smashed into the ground. Kaku and Gabra, standing only a short distance away, stared in disbelief. It was the first time they'd ever seen Lucci bested in a direct duel. Though Lucci had fought his way upward, harnessing gravity itself to drive his attack, Nethin had managed to shoot him right out of the sky. By far, this was the greatest power they'd ever witnessed. When Lucci's body struck the earth, he spat out blood, but otherwise rose almost unharmed. In mid-fall, he'd already activated his iron block technique. Thanks to his tyrannical physique, the iron block had transformed his body into something harder than ordinary steel, imbued with a toughness that steel could only dream of. How was that even possible? Kaku whispered, eyes wide. Gabra swallowed hard. I've never seen power like his. Lucci sprang out of the crater his own body had blasted into the street, dust swirling at his heels. He looked up at Nethan, suspended motionless in midair. Excitement lit his eyes. Finally, a worthy adversary to test his strength against. Without a word, Nethan's form blurred, and he plummeted straight toward Lucci, his fist coiling like a striking viper. Lucci barely had time to react. He slipped to the side, then flicked his fingers and sent a volley of tiny air bombs whistling through the space between them. The mini explosions shredded Nethan's outer coat, tearing holes in the fabric, but did nothing more. The powerful torsion swirling inside Nethan shrugged off the blast as if it were little more than a breeze. Nethan dropped smoothly to the pavement, gaze cool and unperturbed. He raised both hands slowly and pressed his palms together in front of his chest. With a thunderous roar, shockwaves rippled outward, cracking the asphalt in every direction. The entire block rocked under the force of it. Dust and debris shot into the air, and all at once it was clear. This battle was only just beginning. Under the astonished gazes of Gabra Kaku and the others, the ground beneath Lucci split open like two massive gates swinging inward, then slammed shut toward the center. A flash of alarm crossed his eyes as he lunged to evade the oncoming trap. But before he could clear it, a twisting force surged up through the earth and into his feet, sending a numb tingle through his legs. He managed a staggered step back, just enough to seal his fate. In an instant, towering walls of earth shot up on either side, pinning him between two iron jaws. With Nethan's current mastery of geomanipulation, he could channel raw power through the ground, striking an enemy from below. Though the force diminishes over distance and through layers of soil, if you're caught unprepared, it still delivers a brutal wallop. Boom! The shockwave that followed dwarfed anything Lucci had ever faced, even surpassing his own all-out assault moments ago. 100-meter stretch of roadway split down the middle, then rolled in from both sides like tidal waves, crushing toward the trapped fighter with ear-splitting force. Lucci's heart pounded. There was no time to dodge now. Could this truly be Nethan's signature technique? The reinforcements from CP9, long expected but tardy, finally swept onto the battlefield. Even though each agent had been handpicked and trained by the world government to possess superhuman strength, they all came to an abrupt halt when they saw it. A massive swell of earth, nearly 100 meters across and rising tens of meters high, as if the ground itself had heaved up in one titanic breath. Not one of them had ever felt power like this before. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, with a grinding roar, the hillside cracked. Chunks of soil and stone flew outward as Lucci was hurled from the rupture, slamming into the dirt and rolling to a painful halt. He coughed violently, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Thanks to his iron-hard conditioning and the defensive enhancement of his leopard form, his injuries were far from fatal, but he was clearly hurt. Nethan watched without a flicker of emotion. Nethan had tapped into less than half of his twisting power to unleash the Earth Escape technique. Yet even that was more than enough for his half-orc frame and iron-like muscles to absorb the impact. When you push your physique to its absolute limit, it becomes a weapon unto itself. At a true Jade tier, the seismic distortions and shockwaves you generate could shatter the strongest defenses in a single strike. Clang! Lucci snapped his fingers, flicking a bead of blood from his lip as he fixed Nethan with a suddenly serious stare. It seems our intelligence grossly underestimated you, but at this level of strength, you still can't defeat me. That feeble trick won't harm me a second time. Chapter 104. The True Story of Lucci. Nethan sat at his cluttered desk, quill in hand, the late April breeze flickering the parchment before him. He paused, eyes drifting to the window as he collected his thoughts. It was April 13th in the 22nd year of the Great Pirate Era, a date that, though unremarkable to most, marked a pivotal moment in the hidden history of one man, Lucci. Let me be clear, Nethan began, writing deliberately. The story you know of Lucci begins 8 years from today, when Monkey D. Luffy first set sail toward the Grand Line. But Lucci's own journey was already well underway. 8 years ago, at the dawn of this same April 13th, Lucci was no more than 20 years old. In the years that followed, his reputation would soar. By the time he was 28, he commanded respect as a lieutenant general at Marine headquarters, second only to the admirals themselves. Yet between those milestones, Lu Qi vanished from public view. In the 23rd year, Nathan continued, Lu Qi accepted a clandestine mission. For 5 long years he forewent training, withdrew from every port and outpost, and his true strength, nobody could say whether it had grown or atrophied. Rumors whispered that he was testing himself against unseen foes. Others claimed he was nursing wounds too grievous for open service. Nathan dipped his quill. He imagined Lu Qi, alone on the edge of the world, honing skills that no standard drill could teach. When at last he reemerged, it was not as the fresh-faced officer who had departed. His eyes carried an unspoken authority, his bearing that of a man who had known both victory and loss in equal measure. By the 27th year, Nathan wrote, Lu Qi had reclaimed his post. Yet even then, he remained an enigma. Was he stronger than ever? Or had those 5 silent years blunted his edge? Only the future held the answer. He paused to glance at the date stamped on the parchment's corner, April 13th, 22nd year, and let his pen hover for a moment. In just 2 years, he added, Monkey D. Luffy will breach the Grand Line and earn his title as King of the Pirates. Lu Qi, now nearly 22, will be there to witness it. Slightly older, slightly wiser. And 2 years after that, when Luffy confronts the world government's iron fist in the New World, Lu Qi will stand alongside him in a different capacity. It is Lu Qi who, upon recognizing the true threat posed by Admiral Akainu's zealotry, will deliver one of the Marines' rare public rebukes, an act that will echo through the halls of the world government. Nathan set down his quill, satisfied. He leaned back and read the full entry. It is the end of April 13th, in the 22nd year of the Great Pirate Era. Monkey D. Luffy has not yet left port. His voyage is still 8 years away. Lu Qi, now 20 years old, is on the cusp of a secret mission that will absorb him for 5 years, leaving his true strength unknown. Though legend will crown him a lieutenant general at 28, today he is but an officer with untapped potential. 2 years from now, he will re-enter the world stage just as Luffy sails into the Grand Line. 2 years beyond that, he will stand at odds with Admiral Akainu and guide Sabo along a path no Marine has walked before. Nathan dipped his quill in ink one last time and signed his name at the bottom. The future of Lu Qi was still unwritten, but for anyone who cared to look beyond the surface, the real story had already begun. Between the ages of 28 and 30, his power didn't suddenly skyrocket. It was simply too soon for such a leap. In the original novel, I paced Lu Qi's growth so that, at this point, he's just a bit stronger than a branch lieutenant general, slightly ahead of a headquarters major general. 8 years later, he'll surpass the headquarters lieutenant general, and by year 10, he'll be on par with a full general. That progression stays true to the source material. That said, some readers have complained that the story's later stages make he characters feel overpowered. A few even insist Whitebeard himself isn't truly dominant, but from the viewpoint of captain-ranked officers in the New World, both Lu Qi and Sand Crocodile are undeniably formidable. After all, as an arm of the government's intelligence network, they can't afford to overlook such strength. If you recognize these threats, you must match them. There's no alternative but to train your body to the highest standard. To avoid stirring up even more debate, I've chosen to streamline these power creep explanations in Oda's storyline and leave the finer points unspoken. That should keep the focus on the adventure itself and prevent any more arguments about who's stronger than whom. Chapter 12. The Return of the Sand Crocodile. A scorching wind swept across the endless dunes, kicking up clouds of sand that danced like phantoms under the blistering sun. Legends of old warned that no one could tame this desert, least of all the man they called the Sand Crocodile. 10 years had passed since he'd first risen to fame and infamy, ruling these sands with ruthless cunning. Now he was back. Nathan stood at the edge of the encampment, his cloak billowing in the wind. Across the valley, the crew gathered behind him, each one keenly aware of what was at stake. Many still remembered the stories of Nathan's previous encounter with the crocodile, how he'd charged headlong into the fight, seemingly outclassed, only to unveil a hidden combat form so devastating that even hardened veterans gasped in disbelief. "Last time," Nethan murmured, "folks called me reckless. They said no one could topple the sand crocodile, and yet I stood victorious. But that was a different me." Beside him, Mira tightened the straps on her bracers. "You unleashed your true form. Awakened strike, right?" Everyone in the theater cut version saw it as a gimmick. They barely remember it now. He nodded. "The movie's cut made it look flashy, but gave the impression I won too easily. In reality, I nearly bled out, and pure power alone won't cut it if he's wiser this time." Aaron, warming his staff by the fire, interjected, "Sabo's still hoarding that fire fist fruit he stole. Mera. He promised to share it, but so far none of his protégés can hold a candle to Crocodile. Even with Kaku and the CP9 lot backing me, I'd be a fool to underestimate our foe." Nethan glanced at Robin, pacing in the shadows. "Robin's observation haki isn't fully trained yet," he observed quietly. "She's improved since Skypiea, but 7 months in the sky doesn't replace years of field combat. She can't spot his sand trap ambushes the way she should." Across their camp, the guards polled one another in hushed voices. "Do you really think that fruit's worth the trouble?" one asked. "I've seen Sabo's pupils shake when they face a true powerhouse." "Maybe it's all hype," another grumbled. "Fire fist or not, I don't envy any of us who have to face Crocodile when he's at the top of his game." Nethan closed his eyes, drew in a steadying breath, and let it out in a slow exhale. The wind died for a moment, the desert holding its breath. "All right," he said, voice firm. "He's had 10 years to refine every vicious trick in the book. We have our weaknesses, fine. We'll find his, we'll outthink him, and when the time comes, we'll strike hard and strike together. No more bleeding out, no more close calls." He opened his eyes and met each of their gazes in turn. "Tonight, we face the real sand crocodile. Let's make sure he remembers why none of us ever bows to fear." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the dunes turned blood orange. In that dying light, Nethan's crew, fire in their hearts, prepared themselves for the battle that would decide their fate. During the Judicial Island arc, only 2 devil fruits were actually consumed, Khalifa's bubble fruit and Kaku's giraffe fruit. All the other fruits have already been accounted for. As for Lucci's leopard fruit, its exact timing isn't specified in the original story, so I've placed its acquisition early on. To get the pirate details right, I've reread the manga and rewatched the anime over 10 times, and I consult various fan encyclopedias every day, so there should be no major continuity errors. Finally, this book is scheduled to hit shelves in the early hours of June 1st. From today onward, all updates will follow this release timetable to ensure everything goes live smoothly. Chapter 105, Profound Truth, Six King Spear, Lucci. A deep groan split the air as Lu burst forth from the cracked, upthrust mountain soil. Bruno, Kaku, and the others exhaled in relief at the sight of their comrade emerging unscathed. "No need for backup here," Lucci called over his shoulder, his voice calm but unwavering. "Head to Kaku's position and capture Nico Robin before she slips away." Confident in Lucci's judgment, Bruno and the rest exchanged determined nods and sprinted toward the skirmish where Robin and Lafitte were locked in combat. In the ruined street's center, Nethan stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. "You won't stop me," he said, his tone flat. Without another word, distortion power exploded from him. The ground convulsed as earth and rock roiled upward like a tidal wave, surging straight for Bruno, Lucci, and their squad, threatening to engulf them all. "That's even stronger than before," one of Bruno's men shouted. "Stand clear," Lucci ordered. He coiled like a spring, then leapt into the air, a dark silhouette framed by the moon. With cat-like precision, his tail whipped around, and his boot arced toward Nethan. Profound Truth, Six King Spear, Lightning Claw Tempest. In an instant, 7 razor-sharp slashes tore through the night, each blade of energy honed on Nethan, each designed to shatter his advance in mid-stride. Nethan let go of his control over the swirling slashes. Raising his hand, he pushed them all inward, 7 or 8 invisible pythons of razor-sharp energy coiling together until they formed a single, glowing sphere. In an instant, he unleashed it with a powerful whoosh, whoosh. At the same moment, he sprang skyward with the practiced grace of the moonstep technique, sending the brilliant orb hurtling toward Lucci. Lucci had no wish to engage in combat, But before he could react, a flickering figure materialized at Nethan's right side and delivered a crushing kick. Nethan had anticipated the strike. He twisted his arm, guiding the orb of light even more forcefully forward. Boom! The glowing sphere slammed into the whirlwind of the unseen slashes, and the fierce gust from the kick, producing a deafening roar that echoed in all directions, and sheared the rooftops off half a dozen buildings. Without pausing, Nethan's hand closed into a fist the moment the light ball collapsed. Channeling every ounce of his strength, he drove his punch downward at Lucci. Whoosh! Nethan barely had time to register Lucci's approach before the leopard Zoan fighter blurred past him and reappeared at his back. In a flash, Lucci formed his fingers into the shape of a pistol and fired an invisible bullet straight for Nethan's chest. Lucci's speed and strength far exceeded those of Branch Lieutenant General Dalmesia, whom Rhodes had once fought, thanks to his animal system devil fruit. Even so, Nethan remained cool under pressure. Spotting the attack at the last second, he twisted his body backward, letting the lethal strike slice through empty air. Then, with a crackling surge of gravity manipulation, he boosted his agility and snapped off a powerful backhand blow. Lucci's eyes flickered in surprise as the impact drove him back. Abandoning further assaults for the moment, he sprang upward and landed deftly atop a nearby roof. Nethan flexed his fist, settling into a poised stance as he stared up at his opponent. From the street below, it was clear that Bruno and the others simply couldn't match the power of fighters like Kaku and Gabra. Yet the real test was only just beginning. They'd barely reached the clearing beside Robin's position when Lafitte descended on them like a hawk. Kaku was already teetering on the brink of defeat, only Bruno and the others' timely intervention keeping him in the fight. Lafitte's slippery, unpredictable style seemed unstoppable until Kaku, rallying his breath, finally managed to hold his ground. Across the field, Nethan squared off against Lucci. Lucci's reputation for sheer speed was well earned, and he never tried to match Nethan's raw power head-on. Instead, he danced just out of reach, baiting Nethan into wasted lunges. Nethan knew that if Lucci could break him into a protracted chase, his own slower pace would mean almost certain defeat. Without warning, Lucci's stance shifted, his muscles relaxed, then snapped taut, and he began channeling a forbidden technique, sacrificing strength for blistering acceleration. In a heartbeat, he streaked toward Nethan like a bolt of lightning. Nethan's taunt died on his lips as he braced himself. His form blurred. He met Lucci head-on with a lightning-fast hook. Lucci slipped inside the swing, countered with an elbow, only to have Nethan catch his wrist. In the span of a single breath, their arms and fists collided in midair. Dozens of blows exchanged so rapidly, the world around them seemed to shudder. Boom! Although Nethan's raw speed still trailed Lucci's, his gravity distortion ability combined with the moonstep technique made him almost as fast in midair. Forced into the sky by Lucci's relentless assault, Nethan suddenly warped the gravitational field beneath him, twisting the air into a faintly shimmering arc around his palms. With a powerful downward thrust, he drove Lucci headlong toward the earth. Lucci's eyes widened. With a defiant shout, he reversed direction midair and slammed into the ground dozens of meters away, sending a shockwave of debris outward. The impact buried Nethan under loosened soil for a heartbeat, but the next instant the earth itself seemed to rebel. Soil and stones rippled, heaving toward Lucci's position as if drawn by an invisible force. Cracks split the ground in a perfect circle around him, the upheaval forming a dome-like sphere. Lucci screamed, arms trembling with effort. He dug his fingers into the jagged soil, ripping apart the crumbling rock and earth. With a final anguished roar, he shattered the earthen sphere and burst free, hurtling back into the fight. Lucci had barely stepped out when Nethan was already there, waiting. His eyes were cool and detached. In a single fluid motion, he curled his fingers into a fist and drove it straight down toward Lucci. Lucci couldn't dodge in time. Instead, he dropped his stance, brought both fists together in front of him, and met the incoming blow head-on. Six-form profound truth, spear of the six kings, he roared. Boom! A thunderous shockwave ripped through the air, so fierce it rivaled the thunder of the floating sky islands themselves. It compressed every last fragment of the giant vine's raw force into one pinpoint of energy, before clashing against Nethin's spiraling power. The Spear of the Six Kings is designed to focus all its destructive might into a single, instantaneous strike, leaving no lingering resonance, only a cataclysmic burst at the point of contact. But Nethin's chaotic twisting force was unlike anything Lucci had faced before. When that tightly coiled impact collided with Nethin's distortion technique, it could not remain compact. Instead of a clean, concentrated explosion, the energies tore apart in a violent upheaval, shattering the balance of both attacks in midair. Nethin and Lucci froze in mid-clash, as though time itself had stalled. Then, in the next heartbeat, their collision erupted into a cataclysmic shock. Windows shattered, the asphalt cracked, and a rolling wave of force rippled outward, tearing down the narrow street like an explosion. Hundreds of meters away, Kaku and Jabura were locked in their own brutal contest. Both warriors halted instantly, weapons suspended in the air, as the ground trembled beneath their boots. Did he really just use the Six Kings spear? Kaku whispered, eyes wide. It was unthinkable. Lucci, the agent celebrated as the strongest in 8 centuries, had never before been pushed this far. Though he served in CP9, far from the top echelon of CP0, his reputation was legendary. Kaku and Jabura, stripped of their devil fruits, relied solely on their innate haki. Even at full strength, their internal energy barely reached half of Lucci's. And when Lucci tapped into his devil fruit power, his physical might surged to levels that made them look like children. Even if Kaku and Jabura had joined forces, their combined might would still have fallen short of Lucci's singular fury. Now, however, it was Nethin who had driven him to the brink, and everyone watching knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Chapter 106, Victory and Defeat in an Instant Boom. When the dust cleared and the echo died away, a deafening roar still rang in everyone's ears. In the center of the clearing stood Rhodes, utterly still. Beneath his feet, the earth was fractured in a spiderweb of cracks. Opposite him, Nethin fought to regain his balance. Moments ago, Lucci had driven the lethal Six Kings spear straight at Rhodes, but Rhodes's lightning-quick pivot had nullified the thrust. The raw impact slammed Nethin backward, and he rocketed through the air. He tore through one building with a deafening crash, then careened into a second before finally coming to a stop. Kaku. Look, someone gasped. The assembled fighters stared in stunned silence. How could Lucci's signature spear technique be so utterly defeated? Just moments earlier, he and Rhodes had traded blows as equals. Nethin coughed out a mouthful of blood, every wheezing breath a reminder of the force that had hurled him through 2 walls. He pushed himself up on trembling arms and staggered toward the gaping hole he'd made in the second building. There, through shards of broken stone and splintered wood, he saw Rhodes still standing firm. Nethin's heart pounded. His mind raced. How had Rhodes's strength leapt forward so drastically? During their last clash, when Lucci had demonstrated his renowned Lanjiao skill, Rhodes had been merely evenly matched. Now, this overwhelming power shift was beyond comprehension. Victory had been decided in the blink of an eye, and neither side saw it coming. End of Chapter 106. Nethin watched Lucci's Six Kings spear arc through the air, an attack meant to overwhelm him, force open a fatal opening. Instead, Rhodes had leapt in front of him, taken the blow head-on, and gone down hard on the rubble-strewn street. Lucci's face drained of color as he stared at Rhodes's motionless form. Calmly, Nethin sized up his opponent. He'd always known Lucci was faster than most, but speed alone could be countered. His plan was simple. Start with basic punches to bait Lucci into dodging, then twist his devil fruit power to ensnare him, and finally unleash a single, thunderous strike strong enough to cripple. So far, every step had gone according to plan. In the exchange just now, Nethin had deliberately held back, no more than half his true strength, and even that powerful punch had drawn on only 70 to 80% of his devil fruit's twisting power. He still hoped to turn Lucci's CP9 brilliance to his side. Killing him now would be a waste. Better to keep that tactical mind alive than to leave a brilliant strategist dead on the street. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the shattered buildings, whoosh, signaling the next move in their deadly dance. Nethin steadied himself, ready to twist the battlefield to his will and end this fight on his terms. The next instant, Nethin blurred into an afterimage and hurtled straight at Lu Chi. A wave of warped energy slammed into Lu Chi's body. Though he'd braced himself with the force of the Six Kings' spear and possessed an ironclad physique, the distortion struck too violently. It shattered his iron block formation and sent him hurtling backward, his back smashing through a building wall with a thunderous crash. He tumbled out, coughing blood, grievously wounded. Pain lanced through Lu Chi's limbs, but he knew all too well that if this fight dragged on, he'd lose. Summoning every ounce of will, he inhaled deeply and let his eyes steel with resolve. Instead of evading another blow, he pressed his palms together and called upon his life restoration technique, forcing his wounds to knit shut and holding back the pain. Nethin watched him coolly. He curled his fingers into a fist and unleashed the full power of his distortion ability. The air around his knuckles twisted and shimmered as raw energy gathered on his fist. With a single cold breath, he launched his next attack. Twisted Fist. At that critical moment, Lu Chi ignored the agony of his wound and poured every last vestige of strength into one final, devastating strike. He unleashed his ultimate technique, the Six Kings' Spear, the largest wheel in the 6 types of profound truth. The air itself seemed to crack as his spear met Nethin's thunderous punch. Time froze in that instant. The force of their collision surpassed even the legendary 8-chong fist that Rhodes once witnessed, the 8 treasures Sailor Lao Kai employ. Lu Chi's attack smashed forward like an unbreakable projectile, determined to pierce Nethin's defenses and drive straight through his body. But Nethin's twisting power, masterfully condensed to a single point, met the spear head-on and held firm. For a heartbeat, spear and twisting energy locked in perfect equilibrium. Not even the full might of the Six Kings' Spear could overwhelm Nethin's barrier. Lu Chi's blow shattered and collapsed under the equal force of Nethin's twisting power. The crowd erupted in a stunned gasp as the 2 techniques neutralized each other in midair. The blast from Nethin's shattered Six Kings' Spear ripped through the tower's upper floors in an instant. A writhing wave of warped energy raced downward, reducing the entire structure to smoking debris. Dust and stone rained from above like a deadly hail. Lu Chi's leopard man form was the first to bear the brunt. Gravel pelted his flank, and he was hurled backward with bone-jarring force. He smashed through 3 successive walls before crashing into the courtyard below, a crimson fountain erupting from his mouth. His roar cut off abruptly as the beastly fur retreated, and he collapsed to the ground in his human shape, panting, defeated. Kaku and the others stood frozen at the edge of the wreckage, helpless to intervene, their powers insufficient even to lift a finger. They watched in stunned silence as Nethin descended the rubble-choked stairs, every step echoing like a verdict. Lu Chi had fallen under Nethin's final strike. Nobody had expected the fight to end so decisively. They'd assumed at best a narrow stalemate. After all, Lu Chi was the warrior who'd slain Chiwuhai, feared by all. Yet here he lay broken in moments, the mightiest blow carried by a single, shattering assault. The air was thick with dust and disbelief. Not one whisper stirred among the onlookers. The battlefield, now eerily still, bore mute witness to the truth. Lu Chi had lost, and Nethin, once underestimated, stood victorious. Chapter X. No one had expected Lu Chi to break ranks so spectacularly or so swiftly. Such a rapid rout caught everyone off guard. Only the Navy Headquarters Lieutenant Admiral, or perhaps the secretive CP0, could have foreseen this disaster. High above the shattered building, Nethin hovered as if gravity did not apply to him. He cast a cold, indifferent glance down at Lu Chi, who lay motionless and half-buried in debris, uncertain even if he still drew breath. Then Nethin turned his gaze to Kaku and the remaining agents of CP9. That single look sent an ice-cold shock through them, as if they'd tumbled into a frozen vault. Below, the ruined street was littered with bodies. Lu Chi, Kaku, Gabra, and the rest of the once formidable CP9 lay unconscious, grievously wounded, slipping into comas. The moment Nethin dispatched Lu Chi, the battle was effectively over. On board Spandam's ship, panic rippled through the crew. The deputy chief himself gave no orders to press on or rescue their comrades. Instead, he barked curt instructions to cast off immediately. As the vessel cut its moorings, Spandam even sent a small party ashore to confirm the disaster, before swallowing his pride and conceding defeat. Moments later, Nethan descended to the ground with the graceful ease of a shadow. Lafitte joined him, eyes scanning the motionless figures strewn across the street. Nethan's tone was deceptively casual. "Deep hypnosis is tricky," he mused. "Tell me, Lafitte, how difficult was it to maintain on CP9's best operatives?" Lafitte knelt beside Kaku's prone form and studied his face. "Their combat skills were never in doubt," he said quietly, "but their intelligence network, it was legendary. Here they are, completely subdued." Nithan nodded, eyes drifting back to the horizon. The operation had succeeded beyond expectations, and the world would tremble once the news broke. For now, all that remained was to stand amid the ruins, victorious, and wait to see which domino would fall next. Nithan paced the deck, eyes fixed on the half-conscious CP9 agents strewn across the wooden planks. If he could break their conditioning and recruit even a handful into the Ghost Hand Pirates' peripheral intelligence network, he and Robin would no longer have to risk everything to extract government secrets. He remembered what Lafitte had said. CP9 operatives were plucked from childhood, drilled in loyalty, and brainwashed until their devotion to the world government was absolute. Even Lafitte's uncanny abilities had failed to undo that indoctrination. "Sheer loyalty," Lafitte sighed, rubbing her temples. "They're rock solid, even the weakest among them." Nethan crouched beside a dazed agent, turning the man's head gently. A thought struck him. What if we shattered that loyalty? Could we hypnotize them deeply, so completely that they'd forget who they serve? Lafitte studied him, expression cautious but intrigued. "It's unorthodox and dangerous, but I think it might work. I'm about 70% sure." Nethan allowed himself a small, confident smile. 70% is enough. Let's make them ours." Robin, standing a few paces away, folded her arms. "You really intend to turn CP9 against the government? That's bold." He met her gaze and grinned. "Bold gets results, Princess. Trust me, I've already worked out the details." Nethan leaned back, shaking his head. "We do nothing. From the world government's point of view, once these intelligence operatives, people who know far too much, are taken care of, the safest move will be to erase every record of their existence. And the head of CP9 is a ruthless opportunist. The moment this operation fails, he'll dump all the blame on them." Robin's eyes lit up with sudden clarity. "No wonder you let that government ship slip away." She didn't know how Nethan had learned about the CP9 chief's game plan, but if he said it, she trusted it. He always seemed to possess information nobody else had. Without the constant time they spent together, and without any visible sign of Nethan's outside contacts, she might even have suspected he was still linked to a top-tier intelligence agency. Chapter 107. The frustration of CP9 Mary Geois, known to all as the Holy Land, stands at the very heart of the world government. Within its majestic walls lies an immense, vaulted chamber where the 5 elders, the Gorosei, convene. Today, their usually composed faces are etched with impatience. One elder, brow furrowed, slams his fist against the polished table. "It's those Ghost Hand Pirates again," he bellows. "Why can't we put an end to them?" The other 4 exchange grim looks. Even CP9, the world government's most elite covert operatives, have found this new pirate crew frustratingly elusive. Until recently, the Ghost Hand Pirates were little more than a rumor, barely a whisper in the Admiral's briefings. But now, they've made themselves impossible to ignore, mounting brazen raids across the Grand Line and even slaying the notorious Crocodile in battle. Another elder sighs heavily. "They aren't like the 4 emperors," he reminds them. "Those Yonko hold territory. We know where to target them. But this crew drifts without a base. They vanish for half a year at a time, then reappear and strike again." To deal with threats, the Navy marshals its admirals, each a linchpin of military might and the linchpin of celestial dragon security. Between safeguarding the Tenryubito and keeping the Yonko in check, the admiral's plates are overflowing. Assigning them to chase a phantom crew that dissolves into the mist seems a poor use of resources. A third elder's eyes narrow. He taps his fingers on the table. "Then it falls to us," he declares. "CP9 must be dispatched. They operate in the shadows, swift, silent, and ruthless. Send them to gather intelligence, eliminate key targets, and find out what makes these Ghost Hand Pirates tick." The hall hums with tense agreement. Though CP9's agents operate under the strictest secrecy, the Gorosei know they are their best, and perhaps only hope of quelling the chaos that this wily new pirate force has unleashed. As the council moves to issue its orders, a storm of decisions gathers, one that will test the limits of CP9 and shape the balance of power on the seas. It was clear, turning a blind eye any longer was out of the question. The Phantom Hand pirates, once merely a nuisance in the first half of these waters, had morphed into a full-blown menace. A small breach had become a yawning chasm, and if their reckless expansion went unchecked, the fallout would be unimaginable. After depositing the gravely wounded, unconscious CP9 agents on a deserted islet and sending Lafitte to keep tabs on them, Nithan and Robin climbed back aboard. Nithan stepped onto the deck and found Luo standing by the rail, his surgical tools still strapped to his belt. "Looks like you've reached a decision," Nithan said evenly. Luo wasn't indispensable, yet, but his recent surgical triumphs had revealed a talent too great to ignore. He met Nithan's calm gaze and offered his terms. "If you take down Doflamingo," Luo proposed, "I'll pledge myself entirely to your crew." A half-smile flickered across Nithan's face, but he gave no answer. He nodded to Robin, then turned and disappeared down the companionway into the captain's cabin. Robin watched his back fade into the hatch, then pivoted toward Luo. She rested her chin in her gloved hand, a teasing glint in her eye. "In that case," she said softly, "you'd best start calling him Captain." Relief flooded Luo's features, and he exhaled. The die was cast, and from this point on, their fates were bound together. Nithan wasn't sure whether today's choice was right or wrong, but now that he'd made it, there was no going back. All he could do was put one foot in front of the other and press on. Just as he'd predicted, Spandam immediately scrambled to protect himself. Shifting every shred of blame onto Rob Lucci and the rest of CP9, he, with the help of his father, a powerful world government official, orchestrated an internal investigation. In the end, the government issued a direct order: eliminate Lucci and his team. CP9 had always operated in the shadows, entirely independent of the other Cypher Paul units. But with their cover blown and now branded traitors, they'd lost any reason to exist. It wasn't long before the Beihai Navy bore down on them. The confrontation was brutal. Lucci, still reeling from his earlier clash with Nithan, lay gravely wounded. The other agents were hurt too, none badly enough to finish the fight, but all too weakened to stand their ground. Their only chance was to flee using Blueno's door ability, slipping through dimensions and hoping the Navy couldn't follow. Despite a lifetime of brainwashing and unquestioning loyalty to the world government, none of them would willingly submit to execution at Spandam's command. As Nithan watched the agents vanish through Blueno's portal, he felt the weight of what he'd set in motion, and knew this was only the beginning. In truth, they felt no personal hatred, and their abilities still trailed behind the enemies. Making it out alive was luck enough, so they'd poured all their frustration onto Spandam instead. That bastard would answer for this soon enough. In a shadowy corner of a remote island, the CP9 agents, bruised, bloodied, and seething with humiliation, lay low, tending to their wounds in silence. Jabura's jaw clenched as he stared into the gloom. Across from him, Lucci sat motionless, his face drawn and pale. Losing to Nithan had been a crushing blow. Lucci lived by the iron creed of survival of the strongest. Weakness was a sin, and yet he'd been outmatched. "It can't go on like this." Khalifa finally broke the silence, her voice tight with worry. She scanned each injured teammate. They'd learned basic first aid, but none of them were doctors, and with the Navy on their heels, they'd never found a safe place to heal properly. What they needed was real medical care, antiseptics, proper dressings, time to recover. Jabura was on the mend, inching back toward full strength, but Lucci remained the most seriously hurt. Just days ago, he'd needed help to stand. Only in the last 48 hours had he managed to walk on his own. Until they found a secure clinic or a sympathetic physician, none of them would be fit for battle again, and for CP9, that was unthinkable. Beihai's evening mist curled through the narrow alley where the 4 CP9 operatives had taken refuge. Owl shook his head, worry creasing his brow. "Once our strength returns, not just Lucci's, but Kaku's and Gabra's too, we could face down the North Sea Branch Navy without fear. We'd crush them." Kaku pressed a hand to his chin. "Maybe," he admitted quietly, "but right now we're weak. If we step into public, the Navy will hunt us like dogs. They won't broadcast our downfall, so ordinary people may never know what happened, but it won't stop the pursuit. And our biggest problem? We can't afford the medical care we desperately need. Gabra cracked a bitter laugh. We're no pirates or common criminals. We've carried out the government's dirty work in secret, silencing every insubordinate they asked us to. We followed orders, and now we're on our own. Lu Qi, seated against the damp brick wall with his head bowed, closed his eyes as if to block out the grim truth. The four fell silent, each lost in his own worry, until a voice drifted from the far end of the alley. You don't need to fundraise for treatment. Every man snapped to attention. Lu Qi's head shot up first, his dark eyes narrowing as he searched the shadows. Then a lone figure stepped into view, Nethan. His calm gaze swept over the hidden operatives as he walked slowly toward them, the mist parting around him like a shroud. Nethan's silhouette materialized at the far end of the alley. Kaku, Gabra, and the others who still had any fight left in them snapped to their feet, blades raised and bodies tensed. Their eyes were fixed on him, wary, but also haunted by what they'd witnessed not 10 minutes ago. Despite his average height, Nethan moved with a confidence that pressed on them like a vice. They still remembered how effortlessly he'd torn through Lu Qi's men. From the front of the group, Lu Qi staggered upright, wiping blood from his lip. What are you doing here? Gloating over your so-called victory? He spat. Nethan's lips curved into a brief, humorless smile. He shook his head. I'm not here to mock anyone. I've come for one reason, and one reason only, to give you a choice. Kaku exchanged a wary look with Gabra. What choice? Nethan's voice was calm, but it rolled through the narrow brick walls like thunder. Option 1, you do exactly as I say. Option 2, you stay right here, and die. A tense silence followed. Then Kaku ground his teeth, her knuckles whitening on the hilt of her sword. You've got to be kidding. Serve a pirate like you? That'll be the day. Chapter 108, Bounty, 300 million. The choice is yours. Nethan stood perfectly still, not even flinching, as he addressed them in a calm, measured voice. Let me remind you, he began, you're no longer CP9 agents under the government's banner. You're fugitives, wanted men, just like I am. And you know full well who I am and what the Ghost Hand Pirates stand for. My goal has never changed, to hunt down pirates. At his words, Kaku, Jabura, and the rest fell silent. It was true. Stripped of their CP9 status, they were on the run, their names on the government's most wanted lists, no different from the pirates they'd once been tasked to eliminate. They also knew as much as anyone about Nethan and his crew. The Ghost Hand Pirates never preyed on civilians. Instead, they tracked down and destroyed pirate bands wherever they found them. Any clashes with the Navy were purely defensive, responses to government forces that chased them relentlessly. If Nethan had been some common thug who terrorized innocents, there would have been no chance of cooperation. But his record spoke for itself. His enemies were only the truly wicked of the sea, and that set him apart. Now, with bounties on all their heads, including Nethan's staggering 300 million, there was only one question left. Whose side would they choose? Lafitte's form appeared out of nowhere, silent as a shadow. It wasn't our captain who got you into this mess, he said, voice light and mocking. You know that better than anyone, eh? Rhodes never expected to break CP9's resolve with mere words. It was impossible. At best, a few well-placed comments might shake their confidence. Lafitte's real task was subtler. Pry open those cracks, and pry some more until the agents tumbled helplessly into doubt and fear. Spandam, he muttered, lips curling in a grin. That weasel will pay for this soon enough. Under Lafitte's psychological assault, anger flared across the faces of the CP9 operatives. But their fury wasn't aimed at Rhodes. It was directed squarely at Spandam. He'd thrown them under the bus, piled on blame, and fanned the flames of jealousy. He dangled the promise of self-preservation, hide on the ship, let the Navy fend for itself, then slip away once the mission failed, without ever intending to rescue them. Every ounce of responsibility had been dumped on their shoulders. Ho ho ho, cross him, and you might as well be challenging the world government itself. There was something almost hypnotic in Lafitte's tone, a subtle force that eroded CP9's once unshakable faith. Yet not every mind bowed to his influence. From the moment Lafitte began his subtle interrogation, Nathan sat with his head bowed and his expression unchanged. Lafitte's words flowed over Kaku, Kabra, and the others, drawing out their doubts and nudging them this way and that, but Nathan remained unmoved, as though encased in steel. At length, Nathan spoke, his tone soft but unwavering. "You say weakness is a sin? That's your opinion, not mine." Lafitte halted mid-sentence, surprise flickering in his eyes. He had expected to crack Nathan's will long before now. If Nathan had faltered, the others, Kaku, Jabra, and the rest, would have easily slipped under Lafitte's influence, dooming them all to an irreversible outcome. Yet here was a man who refused to bow before a superior he considered weak, a man who would not allow someone's frailty to dictate their fates. With a wry smile, Lafitte returned his attention to Kaku and Jabra, softly steering them back under his subtle web of persuasion. Meanwhile, Nathan directed his calm, steady gaze at Rob Lucci, probing the veteran agent's heart with nothing but truth. Among CP9's operatives, Lucci had always stood a tier above the rest. In the original records, he had once fallen to Luffy's crew and been declared a fugitive by the world government, only to claw his way back up, become the chief of CP0, and even hold his own in a fierce, unfinished duel with Sabo, the man who wielded the flame fruit. Now, Nathan was determined to learn whether Lucci's owned resolve would finally crack under the weight of his own history. Nathan's reputation preceded him. With that kind of power and potential, even Rob Lucci would respect him, if he ever chose to sail under the Ghost Hand Pirates banner. But Lucci had no intention of standing in any man's way. The former CP9 agent remained perfectly still, eyes locked on Nathan. After a silence that stretched across the deck, he spoke, voice deceptively calm. "I know exactly what Rhodes is after, and I see through Lafitte's schemes, but none of it will sway me. I am Rob Lucci, the strongest CP9 operative in 800 years. Surrendering or aiding pirates, that simply isn't my way." He let those words hang in the air, then added quietly, "That said, I won't judge Kaku and the others for choosing their own paths. I can swear fealty to justice itself, but I will never bow to its enemies." A low hum of power rippled through Lucci's body, and for a heartbeat he struggled to keep his leopard model transformation in check. Then, to Nathan's surprise, he offered the rarest of compliments. "You're the only opponent I've ever truly respected." For the first time, Nathan's stern expression softened with a touch of regret. "Had we crossed swords a year ago," he said, voice honest, "this duel would have gone down in legend. It's a pity we couldn't have that moment back then." Nathan caught the flicker of a confident smile on Lucci's face, then Lucci hurled himself at him with everything he had. Crash! Mid-charge, Lucci froze, suspended in midair, as Nathan's fist drove into his chest. "Lucci!" Kaku and Jabura shouted, faces pale with shock. Lucci collapsed out of his leopard-human stance, sliding to the deck. His fur and flesh looked entirely healed. No scars, no bruises, but Nathan knew better. Inside, every organ lay in ruins. "This is astounding," Lafayette murmured, shaking his head. He'd nearly completed the subtle mental guidance and initial hypnosis he'd planted. Lucci had surrendered of his own accord, otherwise Lafayette might not have been able to stop him. Still, he'd continue to refine his methods. After all, even though Kaku and the others had felt the effects of his influence, their deeper psychological cracks offered Lafayette the perfect inroad to dominate their minds. On the far side of the chamber, Nathan relaxed his stance and drew back his fist. At that exact moment, a familiar chime sounded in his consciousness. "Mission complete. CP9's strongest agent in 800 years, Rob Lucci, has been neutralized. Award, +100 talent proficiency, +1 free talent point." Nathan glanced down at Lucci's motionless form. He pressed a hand against his chest, still feeling the echo of the impact. Life or death? Had it all been worth it? He wondered, voice barely above a whisper. Nathan stood at the prow of the Ghost, the sea wind tugging at his coat as twilight painted the horizon in bruised purples. Below him, Kaku and his remaining comrades lay bound on the deck, their faces a mixture of rage and sorrow. "You were worthy opponents," Nathan called down, his voice carrying over the creaking timbers. "But you met me too late." A hollow silence followed. Since Lucci's death, Kaku and the others had been consumed by hatred, though not for Nathan, but for Spandam, whose betrayal had cost their leader his life. They needed no prompting from Lafitte to despise the world government agent. Nathan's gaze drifted to the farthest point of the deck, recalling their first clash with Lu Chi. "I remember when Rhodes defeated him," he said quietly. "He spared Lu Chi out of respect for an honorable fight. This," Nathan gestured toward the wounded pirates, "this bloodshed is entirely Spandam's doing." At that moment, Lafitte appeared at his side, her dark eyes glinting in the dying light. She swept her gaze across the downcast crew. "The induction is complete," she announced, voice as smooth as silk. She turned to Kaku and the others. "From this point on, you are members of the Ghost Hand Pirates." No one moved. Their grief for Lu Chi hung heavy between them, yet their path was clear. "Next comes the conditioning," Lafitte continued. "Dr. Luo will heal your wounds while I guide you through deep hypnosis sessions. In time, your loyalty will be absolute." Under guard, Kaku, Bale, Cloy, and the others were led below decks to the ship's infirmary. Dr. Luo, a gaunt, severe-looking man, waited with a table of salves, tonic syringes, and strange devices. Over the following days, he tended every fracture and gash with advanced surgical techniques, while Lafitte conducted trance-like sessions designed to realign their minds. At dawn each morning, Kaku awoke to the echo of her voice, threading suggestions of unity and purpose into his dreams. Day by day, the pain of losing Lu Chi was tempered by a new resolve, to serve the Ghost Hand, to ensure Spandam would answer for his crimes. 1 month later, the Ghost glided into the heart of the Grand Line and dropped anchor off a vast, jungle-clad island. Along its sheltered shore, long wooden docks led to a cluster of tents where brass boxes, the so-called phone bugs, rested on trestle tables. Here, every newly minted Ghost Hand operative received one of the devices. With a simple turn of the dial, each bug sprang to life, knitting its bearer into the ship-wide intelligence network. From this hidden island, the Ghost Hand Intelligence Organization began its clandestine work. And under Nithan's command, even the once reluctant pirates would become vital cogs in the wheel of vengeance and ambition that now drove the crew of the Ghost. Meanwhile, the world government revised the Ghost Hand Pirates' bounties. Robin's reward climbed to 80 million Baileys, Lafitte's to 120 million, and Rhodes' skyrocketed to a staggering 300 million Baileys. Chapter 109, Bounty, 300 million Baileys. Until now, the supernova with the highest reward in the first half of the Grand Line had been Pirate Batra, at 280 million Baileys. But Nethan's bounty had just eclipsed him, making Ghost Hand, Nethan the top supernova in this era's first half of the Grand Line, among those wanted for over 100 million. As his crew distributed Navy-wanted posters across the seas, rival pirates couldn't help but stare in disbelief. 300 million? What on earth did he do to earn that? One muttered. Off the coast of the Chambord Islands, another supernova, himself carrying a bounty north of 100 million, watched Nethan's new poster flutter down and let out a low whistle. That guy really pissed off the world government and the Navy, and he's still alive. You don't see that every day. A lanky pirate with a cigarette dangling from his lips grinned. "We're heading into the new world soon. I wonder if Nethan can even survive out there." Nearby, a bald man in a teal coat rubbed his shiny head with frustration. "That brat never stays in one place. Mark my words, sooner or later this old man's gonna catch him." In the first half of the Grand Line, any pirate with a bounty north of 100 million berries commands global attention. Survive that stretch with such a reward, and you're well on your way to becoming a high-ranking officer under one of the 4 emperors once you enter the New World. By contrast, the New World is teeming with pirates boasting bounties above 100 million, yet few of them draw more than a passing glance. So the sudden rise of Ghost Hand Rhodes' bounty to 300 million berries has everyone talking. Weren't rumors saying he'd gone down with his ship? What could he possibly have done to warrant another 100 million on his head? When the announcement hit, up from 200 million, shock spread like wildfire. The government's cover-up of the CP9 affair meant that Rhodes' defeat of the Cypher Paul agents in the North Sea never saw the light of day. Only a handful know the real story. Even so, this massive jump in his bounty has sent ripples through the Grand Line once more, reigniting interest among all those who'd assumed he'd been quietly disposed of by the world government. The world government and the Navy have long regarded the ghost hand pirates as a persistent thorn in their side, an affliction they've tried and failed to eradicate. Bounties on the crew's heads have climbed ever higher. Every admiral, every battleship, every secret task force is hunting them down without mercy. Never before has any pirate crew so brazenly shamed the government and Navy multiple times before even reaching the New World. And to top it all off, no crew has ever survived the perils of the first half of the Grand Line, only to enter the New World with their reputation and their freedom fully intact. Now, on a strategic island midway through the Grand Line, Nethin convened with his CP9 operatives. He'd placed these covert agents there precisely to carry the Ghost Hand's advantage into enemy territory. Leaning over a battered naval chart, he laid out their first assignment in two distinct objectives. First, Nethin said, voice low but firm, I want exact intelligence on every supernova pirate whose bounty exceeds 100 million. I need their current locations, their plotted courses, and any resupply points they rely on. No detail is too small. He let the gravity of that sink in before moving on. Second, compile exhaustive dossiers on the 7 warlords of the sea, their movements, their strongholds, every rumored rendezvous. Above all, pin down their precise coordinates. A subtle spark of satisfaction lit Nethin's eyes as the CP9 agents rose and melted into the dawn mist, scrolls and coated satchels in hand. With those 2 missions underway, the Ghost Hand pirates would not only remain one step ahead of the Navy, they would carve their own path into the New World on terms defined by no one but themselves. Nethin stood on the deck, gazing out over the rolling sea, and murmured to himself, Elif, if we don't pick off enough prey in the first half of this voyage, we'll have to plunge into the New World immediately. The moment the government or the Navy moves against us, it could mean CP0 operatives, a full-scale slaughter order, or worse, an admiral sent in person. He didn't know CP Nero's inner workings, but from what he'd heard, ever since Lucci joined their ranks, his power had grown to rival Sabo's after eating the Maramara no Mi. The top fighters in CP0 might not be much weaker than a Navy admiral. Already, the Demon Slayer had dispatched 10 large warships, 5 vice admirals from naval headquarters, and at least 10 rear admirals. And the thought of encountering an actual admiral chilled Nethin to the bone. Although his own strength now surpassed that of a rear admiral, the gap between him and a full admiral was still enormous. Even after killing Lucci and earning an A in talent proficiency, he hadn't closed that final distance. Nethin studied the Navy admirals with a critical eye. In both physical prowess and sheer presence, they stood at the absolute pinnacle, flawless and formidable. Even the so-called Yellow Ape, derided by Zepha for leaning too heavily on his devil fruit, possessed undeniable advantages. The glittering fruit granted him terrifying speed. Without a natural talent on Luffy's level, Nethin knew it could easily take him a year or 2 to approach Admiral-class strength. On the surface, his situation looked stable, but in truth, he teetered on the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, and he could tumble into the abyss. If he ever hoped to protect himself properly, he needed power on par with a senior officer of the 4 emperors, or, even better, a Navy admiral. Resolute, Nethin summoned the talent system interface. He still had the 100 talent proficiency points he'd earned by defeating Lucci. After a moment's thought, he allocated 50 points to agility enhancement. Speed was his greatest weakness, and right now, it was exactly what he needed most. Nethin realized that if he didn't unleash his full power and score a single decisive hit on Lucci, he might lose the opportunity altogether. Yet if Lucci chose to turn and chase him, escape would be impossible. Lucci's speed already outmatched his, and as a Navy admiral, he was nothing to underestimate. Facing someone like Kizaru, whose only advantage was sheer velocity, Nethin would be utterly outclassed. A sudden golden glow enveloped him, and the universal interface panel updated. Agility enhancement 200, max level. Physical enhancement 350, max level. By pouring 50 points into his talent proficiency, Nethin pushed his agility enhancement from 150 to the absolute peak of 200. A warm surge coursed through his veins, making his body feel astonishingly light, yet every ounce of his strength remained intact. Whoosh! Whoosh! He sprang into a perfect moonstep, his form blurring as he flashed around the ghost shadow and reappeared in the exact same spot. His speed had just jumped by at least 50%. Nethan's sudden surge in power instantly erased the speed gap between himself and Lu Qi. He even managed to edge ahead. Against the Lu Qi of old, this upgrade alone would mean total, all-round domination. With 50 talent points remaining, Nethan paused to consider his next move. After a moment's thought, he assigned 35 points to Overbearing Aura and 15 to Devil Fruit Mastery. The moment he confirmed his choices, shafts of golden light spilled across the bottom of his combat talent tree, flickering and dancing like living flames. His updated skill chart now read Firearm Proficiency, 50 Melee Combat, 100 Devil Fruit Mastery, 405. Rokushiki, Shave, 0. Rokushiki Paper Painting, 0. Rokushiki Moonstep Throw, Overbearing Aura, 50 Armed Intimidation. At last, his Devil Fruit Mastery had broken past the 400-point mark, an apt reflection of the colossal physique he'd forged over 7 months on Sky Island. And with Overbearing Aura rocketing to 50 points, his perceptive range had grown astonishingly acute. In fact, at full activation, he could even sense Robin's every movement through the bathroom wall as she showered. But he could sense the motion, but not the full form. Tracking the Yellow Monkey's movements would still be a formidable challenge. Nethan muttered under his breath as he adopted a more commanding posture. Naval Headquarters. High in the fortress's tallest tower, Admiral Qingzi sat at his desk, rubbing his temples as he stifled a yawn. The ghost hand pirates again? He muttered with a sigh. They're really becoming a nuisance. He remembered the special assignment he'd undertaken just weeks ago, patrolling the open sea for an entire month in pursuit of those elusive marauders. Despite his best efforts, he'd found nothing and returned to port empty-handed, only to discover a mountain of reports and correspondence waiting for him. It had taken days of overtime just to work through the backlog. Leaning back in his chair, Qingji rubbed his eyes and thought of his old friend Lieutenant General Karp. Time and again, the fleet's senior officers had urged Karp to accept a promotion to full admiral, but he'd always refused. Staying a lieutenant general suited him. He didn't have to shoulder the responsibility for the safety of the Tianlong citizens, maintain the family's naval dominance, or sign off on the endless stream of routine orders that came from squadrons across the sea. In comparison, his own desk seemed infinitely more crowded and infinitely more stressful. Nethan frowned as he studied the chart spread across the table. He wasn't about to become the lazy caricature from the original novel. He still intended to earn his reputation as a true general. Otherwise, what was the point of the rank? The Aoichi Sea lay far to the east. Qingji, his aides-de-camp, tapped the route on the map with a gloved finger. Since Nethan's recent promotion to admiral, he'd been buried in paperwork and minor duties, far too many to risk running off after every pirate report. The fleet's chain of command would collapse. And the situation elsewhere was only getting worse. CP9 had been wiped out by Rhodes, and in the Chiwu Sea, Crocodil's squadron was slaughtered by the Ghost Hand pirates. Local branch lieutenants simply couldn't hold the line. Even sending in a lieutenant general might not turn the tide. They'd need forces on par with the famed Demon Slaughtering Order, and those elite units were already committed. Headquarters itself was overstretched. If Nethan pulled 5 of its lieutenant generals off their posts at once, the entire naval command structure would be left exposed. It was a genuine headache. Commander Qingji sat at his desk, pen in hand and chin resting on his palm, lost in thought. After a few moments, he reached for his encrypted communicator and spoke several crisp orders into it. Within minutes, under Admiral Aokiji's command, naval headquarters sprang into action. 6 mighty warships weighed anchor and set out, forming a powerful squadron. At their forefront were Lieutenant General Doberman and Lieutenant General Flying Squirrel. A 6-ship fleet led by 2 lieutenant generals. What's the target? A demon purge? Or a takedown of some notorious pirate crew? Murmured one of the captains, eyebrows raised in surprise. While the Navy regularly dispatched large vessels, sending half a dozen warships, each under a lieutenant general's command, was virtually unheard of. The scale of the operation suggested something monumental was brewing. On the deck of one flagship, Lieutenant General Doberman stood rigid, one hand resting on his sword's hilt. His gaze was fixed on the endless horizon, the sea's roar barely registering in his mind. Beneath his calm exterior, a fierce determination burned. "I will atone for my past failures," he vowed inwardly. "This time, I will not falter." Vice Admiral Doberman of Navy Headquarters stood on the deck of his flagship, flanked by several other vice admirals. Their target, the notorious Ghost Hand pirates. It had been half a month since the fleet left port, determined to bring the pirate crew to justice. Now, they patrolled the Aoyiki Sea, a stretch of the Grand Line nicknamed the Sea of Cherry Blossoms. 5 islands dotted the waters here, each blanketed in lush pink-hued cherry trees. At the edge of one such island, the Ghost Shadow, flagship of the Ghost Hand pirates, lay quietly at anchor. Rumor had it that a single pirate with a bounty exceeding 100 million berries roamed these isles, but no one knew exactly which island he had chosen as refuge. Below decks on the Ghost Shadow, Kaku and the others tapped underworld contacts for any scrap of intelligence. In the ship's training hall, 2 figures moved through a rigorous sparring routine. One was Nethan, the ship's newly appointed doctor, once called Ross, now determined to prove his worth in more ways than one. His partner was Luo, a fresh recruit who had been so impressed by Nethan's dedication that he had insisted on joining the doctor's daily drills. Sweat beaded on Nethan's brow as he parried Luo's strike and launched a counterattack. Though he had promised to confront Doflamingo himself when the time came, Nethan refused to leave anything to chance. Every muscle memory, every drop of effort counted. Even against the backdrop of warships prowling these waters, he trusted only one thing: his own hard-won skill. Nethan pressed his back against the padded wall of the gravity chamber and took a deep breath. If he ever hoped to stand a chance against Doflamingo, he needed to grow stronger, fast. He glanced over at Luo, barely 16, who was struggling with the lightest set of weighted bands. Physically, the younger boy was no match for Nethan. Luo's face was already beet red after a handful of squats. Across the room, however, Rhodes looked almost unperturbed. He hoisted a barbell laden with 10 times Luo's weight, and with a flicker of his devil fruit power, doubled its effective mass in midair. Nethan let his eyes close and summoned his own ability, gravity distortion. At a mastery level of 400 proficiency, he could now tweak the strength of gravitational pull in his immediate vicinity. Today, he planned to push it as far as it would go, even if it meant temporarily crushing his own body under twice its normal gravity. He flexed every muscle, focused his will, and felt the invisible field around him tighten. Instantly, the weight plates clamped down like iron bands. Nethan staggered a step, and then squared his shoulders. He dropped into a deep squat, exhaling as if he were ripping the world apart. The special reinforced floor beneath him absorbed the crushing force without so much as a creak. Rep by rep, sweat dripping off his brow, he pressed the weight skyward. His muscles burned, his lungs fought to fill with air under the double pull of gravity. But every agonizing rise and fall made him stronger, forging new endurance in his bones and sinew. When he completed 10 grueling repetitions, Nethan let go of the bar. It clanged against the rack as the gravitational field snapped back to normal. He staggered forward, knees bowed, heart pounding like a war drum. Luo looked up from his own exercise and gave Nethan a nod of respect. Even Rhodes paused, barbell at rest, to clap once in approval. Nethan bent over, hands on his knees, gasping. Today's session had been a revelation. Doubling gravity was still a far cry from any gravity fruit user. Fujitora could tear asteroids from the sky. Yet it had amplified every muscle fiber's growth, every drop of sweat translating into raw power. As his breathing settled, Nethan straightened. In that instant, he resolved that no matter how far Doflamingo's abilities outstripped his own, he would narrow the gap. He would keep twisting gravity, keep pushing his body, until he was strong enough to crush the strings that bound Dressrosa and the man who ruled it. With renewed determination, he stepped away from the rack and began preparing for the next round. The path to defeating Doflamingo lay ahead, and Nethan was ready to walk it, gravity's weight or no. Nethan and Luo, one tall and lean, the other shorter but stockier, moved almost in perfect sync beneath the loaded barbell. Each descent and rise was mirrored, yet their experiences couldn't have been more different. With his gravity-warping gift, Nethan felt the bar press down like a mountain on his shoulders. Every squat was an exercise in willpower. Next to him, Luo's struggle was visceral and unrefined, his form a little awkward, his effort raw muscle. The only thing they truly shared was their gaze, steady, unyielding, eyes locked on personal goals. Still, in Nethin's determined stare there flickered something extra, an unreadable spark of purpose. Boom! Nethin's final rep echoed through the practice room. He cut off his gravity field, let the barbell clatter onto the rack, and sank to a crouch, gasping for air. Luo, too spent to finish, shoved his weight aside and collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. At that moment, Robin slipped in, datapad in hand. "Captain Nethin," she announced, "Kaku Intelligence has pinpointed the location of our 160 million Bailey target. The mobile weapon Cress Batra is stationed on the Azure coast. Coordinates are already uploaded to your console." Nethin straightened, adrenaline surging. He met Robin's eyes and allowed a hint of a smile. "Understood," he said. In a single heartbeat, every ounce of fatigue fell away. Mission time had begun. Nethin rose to his feet, steadying his breath and preserving his composed exterior as he regarded Robin with a neutral gaze. Robin began by relaying the latest coordinates, then paused. "Captain, shall I contact the navigator now?" Nethin gave a curt nod. "Inform Lafitte that the recording unit's storage is full, have him turn back immediately and set sail for Spring Island. Don't let our prey get away." These pirates carried bounties between 100 and 200 million, enough that, even with the secondary reward halved, they'd still yield 40 talent proficiency points. That was a sizable gain, with the added chance of snagging bonus talent points. Nethin himself still had 2 free talent points in reserve, and he preferred to hold on to them for the moment. His Twisted Fruit mastery had climbed to 405 points, well on its way to the 600-point threshold. By then, the talent point cost to unlock the Distorted Space ability would likely drop to 3 or fewer. The first half of the Grand Line was a forgiving stretch. No matter how aggressively one pursued pirate bounties there, it was far too early to draw the 4 Emperors' attention. Chapter 1. The Gauntlet of the New World. Nethin stood at the prow of his ship, eyes fixed on the churning strait that marked the threshold to the New World. Beyond this barrier lay a sea so dangerous that only the boldest, or the most desperate, dared venture through. Every pirate who survived this passage faced a stark choice: swear fealty to the fearsome beast pirates, or pledge themselves to one of the 4 emperors. And even if a captain somehow slipped past the Navy's iron blockade and the world government's relentless patrols, an even deadlier reckoning awaited on the other side. The 4 emperors ruled these waters with ruthless ambition and mutual suspicion. No newcomer earned respect without proving his worth through bloodied steel and unbreakable will. For Nethin, that meant one thing: he had to fight or die trying. His greatest enemy wasn't just Kaido's marauders or Big Mom's legions, it was the Navy's dogged pursuit. As soon as word spread of his crossing, Marines would swarm his trail, determined to crush any threat to their dominion. This was more than a sea voyage. It was a deadly gauntlet, a test of every skill Nethin had honed: sharp strategizing, split-second reflexes, and a willingness to send friend and foe alike to Davy Jones's locker if they stood in his path. Cannon broadsides, underwater ambushes, and harpoon volleys all would rain down in a crescendo of violence before he could claim a foothold. Yet Nethin felt that hunger in his chest, an unquenchable drive to rise above the countless pirates who'd failed before him. If he could just outlast the Navy's suppression, if he could slip through their nets and into the fractured realm of the emperors, then he would be closer than ever to seizing his place at the top of the sea. Steeling himself, he tightened his grip on the helm. The wind whipped through the sail, carrying him onward. With a final defiant breath, Nethin guided his ship into the swirling maelstrom. Behind him lay the risks of the Grand Line's last stretch. Ahead lay the cruel promise of the New World. And he intended not merely to survive it, but to conquer it. Chapter 111, Metal Fruit Spring Island, one of the 5 cherry blossom isles of Oichi, was the most prosperous of them all. Here, spring reigned eternal. The air was always mild, the skies always clear, and the delicate petals of the cherry trees carpeted every avenue in gentle pink. Locals fondly called it the Island of Spring. Yet on one usually tranquil street near the grandest residence, the famed Cherry Blossom Manor, tension hung thick in the air. The blossoms that drifted on the breeze seemed almost out of place amid the rising fear. Inside the stone walls of the manor, a frail old man lay sprawled on the flagstones, breath coming in rattled gasps. A chorus of rough voices echoed through the courtyard. "Steady on!" the old man croaked, straining to sit up as a hulking pirate stepped forward. His face was a patchwork of scar tissue, and his teeth jutted out at odd angles. He pressed his boot down onto the old man's chest, grinding the air from his lungs. "You thought pirates weren't welcome here?" the pirate snarled, lips curling into a malicious grin. He laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "What era do you think we live in now? The age of the great pirates." The old man could only gasp, the words choked off by the pain. Around them, other pirates ransacked the manor's treasury, tossing aside chests and crates. Silver coins clattered on the marble floor. Priceless artifacts lay discarded in their wake. From the edge of the courtyard, a sharp whistle rang out, snapping the marauders' attention. A tall figure, cloak billowing, strode into view. His dark eyes swept over the scene, alighting on the pirate who had pinned the old man. With a single decisive motion, the newcomer drew his blade. "Let him go," he ordered, voice low and steady. The pirate glared, but the newcomer's calm authority gave him pause. Slowly, he lifted his foot, allowing the old man to collapse into a heap. The other pirates stiffened, hands drifting toward their own weapons. Silence stretched. Then the newcomer sheathed his sword. "You have two choices," he said, every word precise. "Leave now, or face the consequences." A tense moment passed. Then, with a collective growl, the pirates backed away, melting into the streets as quickly as they had appeared. The old man coughed, clutching his side. Who are you?" he managed to whisper. The stranger knelt beside him, offering a steadying hand. "My name is Nethan," he replied quietly, "and your manor is under my protection." More than 10 years ago, this cherry orchard manor was the very picture of beauty and tranquility. Now, however, it lay in ruins, and the pirates who descended on it were convinced the estate's fame meant untold riches lay hidden within its walls. "Since this is the grandest manor in the region, you must be hoarding treasure," snarled one pirate, sword raised. "Hand it over, or die." Another cutthroat, known as Mobile Cannon Batra, grinned as he hefted his collapsible hand cannon. "Don't make me blow a hole through you," he threatened. The old groundskeeper, trembling, drew a shaky breath. "There's nothing worth taking here, except these cherry trees." The two pirates exchanged baffled looks. "Cherry trees? What kind of treasure is that?" one sneered. At that moment, dozens of looters swarmed the manor. Smash, porcelain dishes shattered behind the central villa's doors. Pirate after pirate emerged empty-handed, cursing, "Nothing, no gold, no jewels. Where are your hidden riches?" Soon they all regrouped under the sprawling branches of the largest cherry tree at the estate's entrance. With a cruel laugh, Captain Batra seized the old man by the collar and lifted him off his feet. "All right, you old fool," he hissed. "Where did you hide your treasure?" The caretaker gasped, voice breaking. There's nothing here but these trees. They're priceless if you know their secret." Bartra's face darkened with fury. He had asked for the island's greatest treasure, only to be led to a grove of ancient cherry trees. Furious, he coldly tossed the old man to the grove, and, in an instant, his arm liquefied into a silvery fluid before solidifying into a gleaming longsword pressed against the old man's throat. The old man let out a ragged breath. He showed no fear, only resignation as he lay there, helpless beneath the blade. Bartra studied him for a long moment, then a cruel smile spread across his lips. "So the island's most precious treasure is its cherry trees?" he sneered. "Very well, I'll claim your treasure for myself." He turned to his men. "Set fire to every tree, leave nothing behind." Within seconds, torches sparked to life, and the grove of centuries-old blossoms erupted in flames, petals drifting like snow through the smoke-filled air. The old man had closed his eyes, ready to die, until those words jolted him back to life. His lids snapped open, and with a roar he heaved himself upright. Both hands clamped around the longsword that Bartra's arm had transformed into. You can't! No, this manor is mine!" In a fluid motion, Bartra's arm reverted to its natural form. He didn't drive the blade home. Instead, he delivered a single, devastating kick. The old man was sent flying, crashing to the ground beside a cherry tree. A deafening boom followed as an incoming shell struck the tree, erupting its delicate blossoms into flame. The pink petals blurred into molten gold and crimson, as if the sky itself were burning away. The old man scrambled to his feet, every joint protesting, and staggered toward the inferno. But his aging body, battered by countless blows, refused to obey. Helpless, he could only watch the blaze consume branch after branch. "You, demons," he wheezed, voice trembling with fury and despair. A cool, amused voice drifted in from the manor gates. "What a splendid sight!" Rhodes and Lafitte stepped through the entrance, their expressions alight with admiration. They paused on the scorched earth, taking in the burning cherry tree and the shattered courtyard beyond, as if beholding the centerpiece of a grand performance. Nethan and Lafitte stepped into the tavern, and every head turned. These weren't the Straw Hats. These were seasoned pirates who'd heard the rumors about the new supernova in the first half of the Grand Line, a bounty north of 100 million berries. Recognition spread through the crowd like wildfire. "You? You're Ghost Hand Rhodes." Someone gasped. "The Demon Sheriff?" The name brought a hush over the room. Among all the supernovas out here, Nethan was by far the most influential. None of them had expected to run into him in this backwater port. Perched casually on a charred cherrywood beam, Nethan let his gaze sweep across the assembled pirates until it settled on Bartra and her crew. He gave them a slow, cold smile. "This place," he said softly, "feels just right for a funeral, though I admit it's a bit too extravagant." Bartra's face darkened. She'd heard the stories of the Ghost Hand pirates, shady dealings, sudden betrayals, ruthless executions. Now she realized they'd been marked. "You think you can just cut off a head worth 160 million berries and ride off into the sunset?" she snarled. "You'd best watch your teeth." Nethan's smile widened as a sudden gust swept through the tavern, flickering the lanterns and sending his coat whipping open behind him. Silence fell like a shroud. Everyone braced, sensing that the real storm was about to begin. Nethan had barely stood there, hands clasped behind his back, when he suddenly vanished, and in an instant reappeared directly in front of Captain Batra. His palm flickered against Batra's chest, unleashing a burst of distortion energy. Boom! The captain's torso collapsed inward as if it were wet clay, yet no blood sprayed. Instead, pale silver liquid sluiced out, pooled on the deck, then, almost as quickly, swirled back together until Batra stood unscathed. A ripple of astonishment ran through the pirate crew, but it was soon replaced by relieved chuckles and sly grins. After all, in all their battles to date, only one enemy had ever managed to injure their captain, and that foe had long since been beaten. Even with Rhodes's 300 million bounty looming over him, their faith in Batra's strength remained unshaken. "What a joke," one pirate sneered, shaking his head. "All that hype, and this is it." He raised his blade. "Spiral blade." Bartra's lips curled into a wicked grin. With a sudden flourish of his arms, his very essence burst free from his body, liquefying in midair and reshaping itself into two whirling, razor-sharp hook blades that sliced toward Nethan. Chapter 112, Lieutenant Generals. Nethan flicked his wrist, and his twin hook blades shot out in perfect unison. He fixed Bartra with a steely gaze. "So this Superman fruit is a metal devil fruit? Intriguing. Kaku's brief mentioned your metal abilities, but I didn't expect anything this advanced. It's almost like an evolved hardened fruit, a liquid metal variant reminiscent of Katakuri's mochi fruit, but far more fluid, verging on a Zoan-level transformation. If you ever manage to awaken this power fully, you might even outclass the elemental fruits." Bartra let out a harsh laugh as he caught one of the returning blades midair. His eyes glittered with excitement. "Interesting? Oh, you'll see just how despairing it can be." With that, his arm melted into a flowing stream of metal, reshaping itself into an impossibly sharp spear. In a heartbeat, he thrust it toward Nethan's chest. Nethan didn't hesitate. He intertwined his fingers, formed a tight fist, and unleashed a flickering punch, an unpredictable whip-like strike aimed to meet Bartra's metal spear head-on. There was no time for hesitation. Boom! The collision sent a shockwave rippling across the deck, metal screaming against metal in a burst of raw power. Both fighters stood locked in combat, each probing the other's strength, as sparks flew around them. Batra's eyes flicked to Rhodes's outstretched fist as her spear whistled through the air. She'd been certain it would pierce his guard, but the instant the steel head struck, it splintered from the tip inward, shards spraying everywhere. At the same time, Rhodes's arm, once mangled, snapped back into perfect form as if healed by magic. Before she could comprehend what was happening, an unimaginable torsion force erupted from Rhodes's arm. Batra felt her own right arm wrench and splinter. Bones crushed beneath her skin, and blood spurted in an arc. A howl of agony tore from her throat as the world spun and she was thrown backward. "Ah!" Batra screamed, collapsing to the deck and cradling her shattered limb. Around her, the ship fell deathly silent. The pirates who'd been sneering only moments before now stared in frozen horror, eyes wide, mouths agape. "Captain, your arm!" one sailor finally managed to gasp. Another tried to rush forward and help, but his feet felt glued to the planks. A third backed away, pale as a sheet. From the far side of the deck, Nethin stepped forward with slow, purposeful strides. He surveyed Batra's broken arm with cold detachment. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face. "You call that an attack?" he asked quietly, though his words carried across the hush. "A shame, such a formidable devil fruit, and it's squandered in your hands." Batra's scream faded into a desperate whimper as realization dawned. "No, this can't be." Her words dissolved into tears of pain and disbelief. Nethin merely shook his head, the faintest trace of pity in his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and began to walk away, leaving the shattered wreck of Batra's ambition and her arm behind him. Nethin advanced without a word. Batra's eyes went wide with a mix of awe and terror as Nethin's fist slammed into his metal shell, an alloy supposedly tougher than steel. The impact shattered the plating like glass and drove straight into Batra's core, shearing off his arm in a spray of sparks and twisted metal. "How?" Batra gasped, stumbling backward, molten silver liquid seeping from the wound. "A frog at the bottom of a well," Nethin replied coldly. He flicked his gaze toward the quivering cyborg and then raised his boot. Before Batra could solidify his form again, Nethin came down with crushing force. The silver goo gave way underfoot, bones and oil-like blood spattering like rain. Within moments, the so-called mobile weapon lay broken and silent. "Bounty, 180 million belly, claim complete." A hollow display flickered at Nethin's side, plus 40 talent proficiency. He pocketed his reward, expression unreadable. From the shadows, Lafitte strolled forward, a predatory grin curving his lips. "Dominance," he murmured. "Ured is something you can't even imagine, and you won't have the chance to learn." With that, he unleashed a low, mocking laugh. The surviving pirates froze, already chilled by the loss of their captain, now faced with a second wave of destruction. Lafitte moved like a phantom, his blades flashing in twin arcs. 7 men dropped before they could draw a proper breath, their bodies collapsing in heaps as Lafitte's laughter echoed across the deck. In under a heartbeat, the pirate crew was no more. Nethin and Lafitte stood side by side amid the carnage, silent testament to a clean, unstoppable victory. Nethin stood unmoving as the remaining pirates scattered in panic. With a deliberate lift of his foot, the ground beneath them rippled and heaved. In an instant, the earth coalesced into a massive sphere of mud and stone, engulfing every last marauder and crushing them into silence. Once the threat was gone, Nethin raised his hand. The soil shifted again, flinging shattered bodies and dark pools of blood beyond the manor's walls. Then, as if he'd commanded the very land to obey, the churned earth surged toward the burning cherry tree at the courtyard's edge. Flames hissed to life among the blossoms, but Nethin's intervention smothered their spread. Embers died and smoke curled harmlessly skyward. Cough! Cough! An elderly man who had stood guard over the mansion for decades coughed twice, his weathered frame trembling as he rose to his feet. Tears glistened in his tired eyes. He recognized Nethin, once a feared pirate lord, and yet here he was, slaying Batra's crew and quelling the blaze that threatened the centuries-old Sakura manor. "Thank you," the old keeper whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. Nethin inclined his head. "It was nothing," he replied softly, glancing back at the now still cherry tree. "Are you the only one left to guard this place?" The old man sighed, a frail smile breaking through his exhaustion. "Yes," he answered. "It's just been me." Nethin reached out and gently caught a drifting cherry blossom petal. He shook his head, then turned and strode out of the manor, with Lafitte falling in step beside him. Inside the courtyard, the old man known as Ghost Hand Rhodes exhaled deeply and settled back against the fractured stone. A great cherry tree lay splintered, but the manor's defenses had held. Rhodes allowed himself a wry smile. His real methods bore little resemblance to the Navy's polished reports. They were closer to the rogue tales that circulated in back alleys. Shaking his head, he murmured, "I wonder how the Navy and government will spin this." With Bartra's faction dismantled, the primary objective was complete. Thanks to the magnetic containment field stabilizing the recording device, the data would remain intact for at least 10 more days, ample time for Nethan, Lafitte, and the others to scatter. The island's blossom-lined avenues were a rare treasure, and even the ever-pragmatic Lafitte seemed charmed by the petals drifting in the breeze. 5 days later, Rhodes found himself strolling beneath those same cherry trees. Pink blossoms fluttered down like confetti, and every so often a Gyeongsam-clad passerby drifted into view. Then a faint buzz in his pocket snapped him back to the present. The covert bug he carried had just received a signal. Rhodes paused, slipped his hand into his jacket, and drew out the hidden communicator, bracing himself for whatever message lay waiting. Nethan pressed the earpiece tighter to his ear. From the other end, Lafitte's voice, unusually serious, crackled through. "Captain, we have a situation. 5 ships were spotted off the west coast. No, make that 6. They're large warships, directly from Navy headquarters, and it looks like they've been anchored there for some time. 6 battleships from Fleet Command. Such a display of force was without precedent. If the main Navy had actually sent heavy warships this close, it could only mean one thing. They were hunting the Ghost Hand pirates." Nethan's jaw tightened. He muttered to himself, "So they've finally shown their hand." Even with Kaku's far-flung informants and the Ghost Shadow's lightning-fast couriers, no pirate crew could evade a navy that monitored every island port. Over the bug, Lafitte asked quietly, "Shall I dig up more specifics?" "Not yet," Nethan replied, his gaze fixed on the empty street below. "They've already arrived. We're a step behind this time. Let's just hope we don't run into the Admiral." At the fork in the road, the street lay deserted except for drifting cherry blossoms. Then, from 3 directions, boots thundered. Tread, tread, tread. No voices, only the echoing footsteps, ominous and unrelenting like the muted warning before a tsunami. Seconds later, they appeared around Nethan. Straight ahead strode Admiral Silas Roderick, his lieutenant admiral epaulets gleaming on a Navy Justice cloak, a dark purple mohawk crowning his head. To Nethan's left came Vice Admiral Ramona, Flying Squirrel Sato, her crisp brown jacket thrown over her own Justice cloak, a smoldering cigar pinned to her lips. On the right marched Vice Admiral Goel Mozambique, expression implacable, flanked by his officers. Nethan remained perfectly still. He reached into his pocket, pressed a small phone bug to his ear, and spoke in a low, even tone. "Lafitte, Robin, take the Ghost. Under no circumstances let the Navy lay a hand on my ship." He clicked the bug shut, tucked it away, and let the rising breeze scatter the cherry blossoms around him, silent witnesses to the standoff unfolding in the empty street. The sea lanes fell eerily silent as the last naval squadron charged in from the west. Both opposing forces instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path through the throng of ships. From the mist-shrouded waves, a lone figure emerged, a broad-shouldered admiral with a ragged scar etched across his left cheek. He walked ashore with deliberate steps, flanked by 2 lieutenant admirals, codenames Flying Squirrel and Mozambique, so that together they formed a tight triangle. At its apex, they had Rhodes itself completely hemmed in on the street known as Cherry Blossom. The 3 high-ranking officers stood in rigid silence, and the rubble-strewn avenue felt as though it might collapse under the weight of their mutual distrust. Cherry Blossom Street had never seemed so cold, so suffocating. Then, as if summoned by fate, Doberman appeared at the far end of the road. His arrival snapped the frozen tableau to life. He advanced with measured steps, eyes locked on the lone young man standing just inside the Admiral's circle, Nethan, known in the underworld as Ghost Hand. Doberman halted a dozen paces away. Without a word, he placed his right hand on the ornate hilt at his hip and drew his blade from its scabbard in one smooth arc. The steel whispered as it came free. "At last," Doberman said, voice low and steady, "we meet, Ghost Hand, Nethan." Far out at sea, news of 6 Titanic Navy warships appearing off Spring Island spread like wildfire. Every intelligence service, every pirate consortium, every sovereignty from one coast to the other sat up and took notice. 3 lieutenant admirals and half a dozen battleships, an armada the likes of which hadn't been seen in decades, were converging on this remote outpost. What on earth was the Navy planning? Within hours, operatives everywhere scrambled to piece together the truth. The final reports they uncovered were as astonishing as they were chilling. A few days ago, the infamous Ghost Hand pirates showed up off Spring Island. In response, the Navy dispatched 6 full-sized warships from headquarters, an overwhelming demonstration of force that left every pirate captain on edge. No matter how daring your plundering, you never cross the Navy or the world government without paying a terrible price. It's an ironclad rule. Once you draw their wrath, there's no escape unless you're one of the 4 emperors. For too long, the Ghost Hand pirates had embarrassed the mightiest power on the seas. Now, at last, the world government and its navy were ready to reclaim our authority, and they intended to do it in spectacular fashion. Chapter 113. This is Xiaofeng's 3rd fan work, following Naruto, the strongest shock escape, and the god-level sword soul system. I've stumbled a few times along the way, but I'm finally back to writing fanfiction. This chapter marks my first testimonial entry since reaching VIP status, an accomplishment I nearly forgot in the whirlwind of everyday life. Today, June 1st, the chapter goes live. At just a dime, less than the price of a single candy, it's as affordable as it is heartfelt. Longtime readers know I've run into some difficulties recently, but that's no excuse for skipping updates. I remain committed to delivering fresh chapters on schedule, and I'll be adding bonus content along the way. If you've enjoyed the journey so far, please consider supporting me with monthly tickets and subscriptions. Your encouragement means the world. Thank you. Chapter 114, In the Name of Justice, Part 1. Admiral Doberman's eyes were ice cold. He'd never imagined that a pirate hunter from the Western Sea could push matters this far, but it stopped here. Whatever folly Nethan had committed, Doberman would personally see it wiped clean. The officers standing behind the admiral exchanged uneasy glances. None of them knew the full story. They only saw Doberman's decision to summon 3 headquarters lieutenant generals against a single privateer. It was a show of force they had never expected. Division lieutenant generals, those who command individual fleets, were powerful in their own right. But headquarters lieutenant generals formed the true backbone of the Navy, embodiments of its greatest strength. Above them stood the true generals and marshals, officers so formidable they were almost inhuman. Across the entire naval headquarters, only a dozen or 20 active officers ever held those ranks, excluding the semi-retired and those called back in emergencies. Division lieutenants, no matter how talented, simply could not compare. And now, 3 of the Navy's top commanders were on their way to deal with Nethan, a force second only to the legendary Slaughter Order itself. Nethan, a pirate with a 300 million berry bounty, now faced the Navy's most fearsome response. 3 lieutenant generals had been mobilized straight from headquarters. That glaring show of force made one thing clear. The Admiralty took the Ghost Hand pirates dead seriously, and they weren't about to leave Nethan any wiggle room. Clang! Flying Squirrel half drew his blade and trained a cold, unblinking stare on Rhodes. At his side, Mozambique's hand hovered over his own hilt, his eyes ice. The narrow street fell into a heavy hush. Even the Navy's seasoned officers from headquarters swallowed hard, hearts pounding with nerves and dread. It was as if a volcano were holding its breath, waiting to explode. Rhodes met Doberman's gaze across the tension-choked space and spoke in a low, measured tone. "Oh, so it's you." He'd always imagined himself as a free agent, a pirate hunter without strings, answering to no one but fate, pursuing targets, honing his skills, climbing ever higher. But corruption deep within the Navy and its obsession with prestige had slammed that door shut. Now, there was nowhere left to go. From the Navy's point of view, honor and prestige are everything, far more important than the reputation of a lone pirate hunter in the West Sea. But that pirate hunter is Nethan. Dying for justice? Don't be ridiculous. He's no saint. He refuses to play along with anyone's notions of good versus evil. He remains wholly neutral, and he'd rather sow chaos than bow to any law. He's utterly indifferent to kindness or legality. Justice can preach all it likes. Nethin takes no pleasure in tyranny or cold-blooded slaughter. Once he'd confirmed Doberman's true identity, Nethin's lips curved into a mocking smile. There was no fury in it, only a quiet, almost amused derision. Who would have expected this? A simple pirate hunter from the West Sea, bold enough to strike at the heart of the Navy's own base, bold enough to assassinate the Major General of the West Sea Branch, the headquarters Major General dispatched here, and even the Lieutenant General of the Great Root Fleet. As the news reached Flying Squirrel and Mozambia, their faces went pale. They exchanged uneasy glances. And Doberman himself, his hand tightening on his sword's hilt, felt a tremor run through him. Nethin had demonstrated far more than raw power. He'd shown them exactly why no one dares underestimate a pirate hunter who answers to no one. Nethin had survived countless brutal campaigns even as a lieutenant general, yet this moment tested him anew. He forced himself to stay calm. His voice was measured, almost detached, precisely the restraint that struck like a blade in Doberman's gut. The older officer's face went dark. This was the last thing he'd wanted to confront. "Remember what I said at the start," Nethin repeated, his tone steady. He stood before the 3 lieutenant generals of headquarters, flanked by a phalanx of naval elites. There wasn't a flicker of doubt or fear on his face, only unwavering resolve. Doberman's fingers dug into his sword's hilt until his knuckles shone white, the cigar clenched so hard in his teeth it cracked in half. "It's over," he snarled, smashing the broken stub to the deck. In the same heartbeat, he blurred into motion, both hands seizing the sword. A dark, commanding aura rippled along the blade as he swung it fiercely at Nethin's head. Nothing could sway his resolve. Lieutenant General Nethin of Naval Headquarters had hunted and executed countless pirates. He made the seas safe, and no one would ever forget his deeds. From the moment he slaughtered Admiral Kale in merciless combat, his sins became stained in blood. He wiped out the dreaded ghost hand pirates in the name of absolute justice, and he would never bow to anyone's definition of right and wrong. Humph. Across the deck, Doberman lunged, his blade gleaming in the afternoon sun. Nethin met the slash without a flinch. Calm and unyielding, he raised a single hand and summoned his armament hockey. Black energy rippled outward, hardening into an impenetrable shell that bent the very air around it. With that distortion, he seized Doberman's sword mid-strike and held it aloft, as if suspending it in stone. "This isn't the end," Nethin said quietly. "It's only just begun. Your so-called justice is nothing but hypocrisy." He closed his fingers around the hilt, channeling every ounce of his power into a violent twist. The blade groaned under the strain, energy crackling down its length as Nethin prepared to shatter the man who dared question his righteousness. Nethin's onslaught didn't waver. Although Doberman had unleashed the full might of his weapon aura, cloaking his blade in a hardened cloak of pitch-black energy, the sheer twisting force Nethin exerted made the sword tremble violently, sending shudders through Doberman's arms and fingers. Before Doberman could recover, a blur shot in from behind Rhodes with a sharp whoosh. The warrior known as Flying Squirrel arrived at Nethin's back in an instant. Cyan energy spiraled along the edge of his blade as he plunged it into Nethin's side, once, twice, each strike driven with brutal precision. Confident his ally would finish Nethin off, Doberman tightened his grip and slammed the tip of his sword against Nethin's upturned palm, cutting off any chance of escape. But Rhodes was faster. With a cold snort, he shoved aside Doberman's weapon with his right hand, then lunged his left to catch Flying Squirrel's blade at an angle. In a flash, the cyan aura shattered with a high-pitched screech. Flying Squirrel's eyes flickered with alarm, but he stood his ground, unwilling to yield. Nethin didn't hesitate. Channeling every ounce of his martial force into his palm and the razor-sharp edge of his sword, he and Doberman moved as one in a deadly pincer. If Rhodes braced against Nethin's blade, he'd have to weather Doberman's slash, and if he guarded against Doberman, he'd be cut down by Nethin. A cold voice cut through the tension. "The Navy bears the banner of absolute justice." Lieutenant General Mozambia, the last of the headquarters trio of commanders, stepped forward with measured calm, his dagger still sheathed. His eyes were stern, his expression unreadable. For those who cower before unchecked evil, our presence is their shield, he declared. And you, who hold no justice in your heart, dare to mock the Navy's cause. Boy, hold your tongue. Before the words had even died away, Mozambia drew his sword in a single, fluid motion. There was no flamboyant aura, just pure, concentrated power honed along the blade's edge. He lunged at Nethan, the strike so fierce it might have cleaved iron like paper. The three lieutenant generals were evenly matched swordsmen. Each had a distinct style, yet their strength was virtually identical. Mozambia's blade, cruelly honed, bore down on Nethan with unerring precision and the promise of effortless steel-cutting power. "Stand down," Nethan warned, planting his feet and readying himself for the clash of blades. The three headquarters lieutenant generals opened fire in unison. At their captain's orders, the remaining naval elite fell back in perfect formation, retreating several dozen meters to establish a tight, all-around perimeter. Charging forward now would only be suicide, especially against three lieutenant generals. No matter how formidable Rhodes might be, he wouldn't stand a chance in this firefight. Chapter 115, 1 Against 3, Part 2. "All talk, yet no justice in your heart," Nethan sneered, eyes fixed on Mozambique's flashing blade. Despite being pressed on both sides by Lieutenant Generals Doberman and Flying Squirrel, he showed no hint of fear. His tone remained calm. In the same instant, a low hum grew around his right hand. The twisting power he'd been gathering erupted in a violent surge, crashing into Doberman and Flying Squirrel's raised defenses. The two generals' arms trembled under the impact, and they staggered backward, forced onto the retreat. Seizing the moment, Nethan pulled his hand back. His fingers curled into a fist, dark energy spiraling around it as a flicker of rage crossed his features. "If you think the Navy's so-called justice will stop me, you've picked the wrong target." With a roar, he thrust his fist forward. Mozambique's sword met him in midair, steel clashing against raw power. The force of their collision shook the ground, splitting the earth between them in a widening crack. Nethan's twisted power crashed into Mozambia, disrupting the oncoming slash and sending the man staggering backward with a single, devastating punch. Everyone watching stiffened. Their prisoner's strength was far beyond what they'd anticipated. No wonder Rhodes had been able to fell Crocodile and Dalmesia and rout the government's CP9 operatives. To reach such power so early on the Grand Line was unheard of. If Mozambia hadn't been halted here and now, he might have grown into an even greater threat. Recovering in midair, Mozambia, known to some as the Flying Squirrel, focused, his eyes gleaming with renewed ferocity. He swept a hand through the air and unleashed his trademark technique, the Arc Moon Slash. A shimmering crescent of energy arced toward Nethan. But Nethan was ready. He braced himself, twisting his own power into a counterforce that shattered the strike and knocked Mozambia off balance once more. Before Mozambia could collect himself, Doberman charged forward, sword gleaming in the dim light. He didn't pause for ceremony or fair play. There was no duel here, no nightly contest of blades. This was a crackdown on a dangerous criminal, the execution of justice by any means necessary. With swift, coordinated strikes, Nethan and Doberman moved as one, determined that Mozambia's reign of violence would end here. Victory, no matter how hard won, was their only goal. The three lieutenant generals of headquarters unleashed a brazen assault. Their sword chi flickered through the air, and in an instant, it cleaved a stretch of street dozens of meters long, sheared through the cherry trees lining each side, and sent a shower of blossoms drifting skyward. Swoosh! Flying Squirrel blurred past, materializing behind Nethan. His blade glowed with pale green sword chi as he carved a lethal arc toward him. With a powerful spring, Nethan vaulted upward to evade the strike. At the same time, he curled his right hand into a tight fist and drove it into Doberman's chest. The blow sent Doberman skidding back 5 or 6 paces, his weight gouging deep impressions into the pavement. A low, mirthless laugh echoed as Mozambique swept his sword in a vicious slash. A torrent of blood-red chi burst forth, brimming with murderous intent, aimed straight at Nethan's midsection as he hovered in midair. Nethan didn't flinch. He caught the blade in his palm, channeling its crimson energy between his hands. With a grinding hiss, he spun that chi into a scarlet spiral, his signature sword pill, and swept it in a backhand strike that met Flying Squirrel's flank. Clang! The clash of steel rang out, sending sparks dancing into the drifting petals overhead. From the flying squirrel glider, Nethin's blade slammed into the blood-colored sword pill with a deafening clang, sending sparks scattering like fireworks. The force threw his opponent back in an instant, but before Nethin could follow up, two figures burst forward in perfect unison. "Blood burial song!" cried Doberman and Mozambique. Side by side, they drove their swords onto an X-shaped formation, unleashing twin torrents of oblique cross-sword chi. The raw energy crackled between their blades, carving a deadly cross in midair as it hurtled straight for Nethin. His expression never wavered. With a single step, he placed his foot at the heart of that seething intersection. A surge of counterforce exploded from his core, twisting the oblique cross-sword chi into a tight helix until it unraveled and vanished in a flash. "Gravity Fist!" Nethin shouted. He kicked off the glider's support strut and dropped from the air, his right fist crackling with concentrated gravity. The target had no time to draw another sword technique, only a frenzied, crossed-blade block overhead. Metal screeched under the weight of Nethin's descending blow. Boom! Nethin's punch drove his opponent, called the Flying Squirrel, hard into the earth. No sooner had the assassin crashed down than a crushing weight unlike any destructive force Nethin had felt before slammed into him. His legs sank into the ground up to his knees, as if the very soil had turned to quicksand. Seizing their chance, the swordmasters Doberman and Mozambia lunged in tandem. Blades met in midair with crackling sparks, two streaks of steel singing as they slashed toward Nethin's chest. In a heartbeat, Nethin twisted on the balls of his feet, flipped his right fist into an open palm, and snatched Mozambia's sword blade. Channeling every ounce of his nen, he inverted the local gravity field around them. What had been down became up in an instant. Mozambia's eyes widened in alarm as his feet left the ground, and he felt impossibly light. But the momentum of his own strike carried the blade's edge crashing back into Nethin's side. Unfazed, Nethin gripped the sword hilt with both hands, yanked it sharply to the left, and flung Mozambia off balance straight toward Doberman. At the same moment, Nethin stamped down with his boot on Doberman's incoming sword, pivoted on his heel, and shattered the steel aside. Two adversaries lay disarmed and stumbling, and the flying squirrel writhed helplessly under the inverted gravity's oppressive pull. Nethin stood at the center of the battlefield, his breathing steady, ready for whatever came next. The three lieutenant generals were almost evenly matched. Individually, their physiques trailed Lucci's leopard form by a hair, but in sheer dominance and the finesse of their swordplay, they outclassed him. And because a swordsman's stroke concentrates force more efficiently than brute muscle, each of their slashes carried greater raw power than Lucci's. Yet even Doberman, Flying Squirrel, and their companion fell well short of Nethin. Alone or in pairs, they might be swift, but Nethin's speed had skyrocketed after slaying Lucci. He could have overwhelmed any one of them. By coordinating all three of their strengths, however, the generals nearly covered each other's weaknesses, moving with uncanny fluidity. Nethin's opening blow was enough to fell a foe. His twisting strike could shatter an opponent's guard and render their arm useless. But when two of the generals attacked in tandem, no single blow could finish one of them. In a heartbeat, they unleashed a whirlwind of steel, a lightning-fast draw, the Blood Moon Meteor Slash, and finally, the Death Sword. Doberman, Flying Squirrel, and Mozambique staggered back under Rhodes's blow, then fell into formation. At a silent signal, the three of them unleashed a simultaneous torrent of sword chi. The hooded figures spun to face them, erecting glowing barriers in every direction. Nethin's eyes flared. He planted his feet, lowered his center of gravity, and propelled himself forward like a falling moon, unyielding, with no thought of retreat. Clenching his fist, he drove the full force of his distortion energy into the heart of the sword chi net. A deep hum reverberated through the air as distortion energy erupted in a wild burst, shredding the web of blade energy into oblivion. Scattered shards of sword chi sliced through cherry branches and petals alike, while jagged fissures scored the ground beneath their feet. Even after shattering their combined assault, Nethin allowed himself 2 deliberate steps back. Sword chi, however spectacular, could not match the raw power of a real blade, but he had to admit it had come remarkably close. After shattering the sword chi net, Nethan's eyes went still, like a deep, silent well. He could almost gauge the true strength of the three lieutenant generals. Before he absorbed Lu Chi's boon, the gap in speed alone would have doomed him. Facing all three at once, he wouldn't have stood a chance. But that had changed. His acceleration now outpaced theirs, and his heightened perception let him read every feint and strike with uncanny clarity. Even more crucial, his spiraling force strikes exceeded each of theirs by 50 to 60%. One-on-one, he would overwhelm any of them. One-on-two, he'd still hold a decisive edge. Against four, he'd simply turn and flee. As for a 3-against-1 showdown, that was a challenge he was more than ready to meet. Capture him. Mozambique's command rang out, sharp and cold. Beneath his impassive exterior, he was surprised. Nethan's strength was formidable. Even flanked by 3 battalion commanders, Nethan slipped and weaved between their attacks. Had there been only 2 of them, they might have corralled him, but subduing him intact would still have been a struggle. Commander Chingji's insistence that all 3 strike together had seemed overzealous at first. Now Mozambique admitted it was unquestionably the right call. The flying squirrel fixed Nethan with a hard, unblinking stare. "You can't win. Stop fighting." One small opening in Nethan's guard, and the battle would be over. Prolonging the fight only risked more trouble. Even victory would come at a high price. Doberman remained silent, but the steely intent in his eyes spoke volumes. He would not let Nethan slip away again. In the center of the stone arena, Nethan stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. Calm amid the storm, he braced himself as the 3 commanders closed in for the final assault. The 3 combatants had just finished sizing each other up. Now, the real battle was about to begin. With a thunderous boom, Nethan slammed his boot into the pavement. Distortion rippled outward through the earth in a 100-meter radius, sending the surrounding sailors careening off balance. Shouts of alarm filled the air as dozens of naval soldiers staggered back on unsteady feet. Unconcerned with those lesser foes, Nethan channeled the twisting energy straight toward the trio known as the Flying Squirrels. As they reeled under the onslaught, he rocketed forward in a blur. In an instant, he stood before Doberman, fists coiled like spring steel. Doberman's eyes flashed with lethal focus. He tightened his grip on the greatsword in his hands, planting one heavy boot to steady himself. With a controlled, dignified gesture, he swung the blade down to meet Nethan's charging fist. Although his heart brimmed with killing intent, Doberman refused to lose his cool. The clash of fist against steel rang out, marking the true commencement of their duel. Nethan's power was on full display in that brief, brutal exchange, an unstoppable force no lone adversary could match. Boom! His fist collided with Doberman's blade, driving the steel back until it bit against his knuckles. The sword's length hummed and trembled under the strain. Even its dark, oppressive aura couldn't withstand Nethan's raw strength. Air rippled around them, and for a heartbeat, they were locked in deadly equilibrium. Then the earth beneath Doberman's feet cracked open, pinning his legs in the broken soil. Veins bulged at his temple as he strained against the grip of the fissures. Before Doberman could recover, Nethan adjusted his stance, and the blade in the other man's hand gleamed as he lunged. Like a shadow unleashed, Doberman surged through the air, his long sword slicing the void to leave a trail of white-hot light in its wake. Ding! With a swift twist of his left wrist, Nethan met the strike. Steel rang out in a ringing chord, an instant symphony of iron meeting iron, as he pressed his palm against the blade's edge, forcing it to yield. The assault halted under the unbreakable discipline of his grip. Nethan hung in midair, every muscle humming and trembling, unable to advance an inch. He raised his blade just in time to block the flying squirrel's slashing sword, then slammed his palm into Doberman's charging fist. Crack! Half of Doberman's body smashed into the dirt, while Nethan twisted in the air, vaulting backward to evade Mozambique's rapier lunge from the opposite flank. Boom! His boots hit the ground, and Nethan snorted low as he unleashed his ghost hand gravity technique. In an instant, the surrounding earth convulsed toward him in a devastating wave. Cracks spiderwebbed across the battlefield, chunks of soil and stone hurled into the sky. Even the Navy's elite forces, who'd fallen back hundreds of meters, were caught off guard by the aftershock. They staggered, footing gone, as dust and debris rained down. "Look at that. The ground's not just cracking, it's flying straight at him," one of the junior officers cried out, eyes wide. "It's Nethin's ghost hand. Unbelievable power," another whispered, horror in his voice. Despite their status as headquarters elites, none could stand against this force. Feet slipping in the upheaval, they exchanged panicked glances. "Retreat! Fall back now," someone barked. "Even the lieutenant generals are on the line. Don't get cut off." And so, amid the rising clouds of dust and the trembling earth, the Navy's finest began to withdraw, unable to withstand the full might of Nethin's gravity-warping assault. "Hold formation, bring up the artillery, and man the sea towers. Don't let that pirate slip away. Lieutenant generals will not be outdone by a single corsair." A colonel from Navy headquarters roared, rallying the disordered fleet. At his command, the sailors fell back in tighter ranks, warships edging farther into the field. Without warning, massive clods of earth, some 10 meters across, others even larger, erupted beneath the pirate's vessel. Each chunk bore a small cherry tree, its blossoms swirling in the wind like pink snowflakes. The enormous stones hurtled skyward, then smashed back down, careening off one another with thunderous booms. Mud and petals flew in every direction, and two monolithic boulders clashed in a crash like an avalanche, spraying clay and blossoms in a wide arc. A cold, mocking laughter rippled through the chaos. The figure known as the Flying Squirrel loomed at the highest point of his floating rock, brow furrowed. He drew 3 slender blades in a single, fluid motion and swung them downward. Searing arcs of steel cut through the advancing stone, fracturing its surface in a shower of debris. But before he could finish, another shadow streaked across the battleground. Nethin burst from the mist of soil, his fist drawn back. With bone-shaking force, he punched the Flying Squirrel's floating platform square in the center. Boom! The impact jolted the blades from the squirrel's grip. He twisted in midair, thrusting his arms up to brace against the unrelenting power of Nethin's blow. Yet even as he gritted his teeth, the pirate's resilience began to falter. Amid the splintered earth and leaping petals, the chase reached its zenith, and the tide of battle, its turning point. Nethin's punch caught his airborne opponent squarely in the chest, hurling him into a 10-meter-wide mass of mudstone. The clay and rock shuddered as though waking from a long slumber, rippling outward to envelop the flying squirrel creature in a crushing grip. Groaning, the stone ground against itself, trying to squeeze the life out of its prey. Then, with a sudden crack, thin lines of cyan light snaked across the mudstone. In an instant, the entire boulder shattered, scattering shards of rock and dirt as the squirrel-like figure tumbled free, blinking in stunned relief. Nethin wiped grit from his eyes and called out, "Watch yourself, he can even bend gravity." Before the warning had fully left his lips, Nethin's attention snapped to his other opponent. Doberman lay half-buried in the loose soil, pinned by Nethin's sweeping low kick. As soon as Nethin activated his earth-shaping power, the ground beneath Doberman fractured and swallowed him whole. Heavy armor saved him from being crushed, but the jagged mudstone shell finally gave way. No sooner had Doberman broken free than Nethin's fist rocketed forward. Boom! The impact echoed like thunder. Doberman managed to raise his sword in a desperate block, but it wasn't enough. He was lifted off his feet and hurled back to earth, carving a deep crater where he landed. Both adversaries now lay separated by shattered rock and torn earth, each struggling to rise. Nethin squared his shoulders, eyes cold and unwavering, ready for the next move. "Don't get too cocky," Mozambia snarled as Nethin surged toward Doberman, who lay crumpled on the ground. Seizing the advantage, Mozambia came around from the side and swung his sword at Nethin. With a swift pivot, Nethin unleashed a backhand punch that sent Mozambia reeling backward. Before Mozambia could steady himself, a flying squirrel descended in a graceful moonstep, its blade slicing toward Nethin's exposed back. Chapter 117, Dark Cage, Part 4. Clang. Nethin leaped sideways just in time. Above him, the attacker, shrouded in distortion energy, dove in a graceful arc and slammed a foot into the earth. The concussive force shattered the floating clods overhead, sending chunks of soil tumbling down. At the same moment, Nethin's own distortion power burrowed into the ground beneath him. Boom! From below came a tremendous roar. Doberman, forced from its subterranean lair, was buried under tens of meters of earth. It shot upward like a missile, smashing into the falling debris with bone-shaking impact. Boom, boom, boom. Each collision sounded like heavy artillery, soil erupting in every direction as dust and cherry blossom petals filled the sky. On the battlefield's edge, the flying squirrel and Mozambia exchanged grim looks. Without hesitation, they charged Nethan in unison, one from the left, the other from the right. Spinning on his heel, Nethan unleashed a lightning-fast twin punch, his left fist meeting the flying squirrel's jaw just as his right smashed into Mozambia's ribs. Boom! The force of the dual strike rippled through Nethan's arms, and his attackers recoiled, but he wasn't out of danger. Mozambia's elbow cut across his torso, and the flying squirrel's tail-coiling kick crashed into his legs. With a grunt of effort, Nethan staggered backward, skidding nearly 10 meters before finally coming to rest. He stood panting, bruised and scraped, but unbroken. Just a few surface wounds, nothing he couldn't handle. Nethan flexed his shoulders, ready for whatever came next. The massive stone suspended in the sky finally exploded, raining jagged fragments down in a shockwave that forced the flying squirrel and Mozambique to skid apart to either side. From the heart of the shattered rock, a torrent of white sword chi erupted, tearing the remains to shreds. When the blinding light faded, Doberman staggered free, his once pristine cloak of righteousness now in tatters, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He looked utterly beaten, yet unbearably furious. A feral gleam flickered in his eyes. Gripping his sword's hilt, Doberman lunged at Nethan with a roar. At the same moment, the flying squirrel and Mozambique darted in from the flanks, reforming their alliance with Doberman as they closed in on Nethan. Behind them, Nethan felt the aftershock of his own giant-scale gravity distortion still humming through his veins like molten energy. That same power that had twisted the battlefield now bolstered his body, driving his strength higher and accelerating every healing process. He snorted, disappearing in a blur of motion and reappearing several paces back. Already the blood at his knuckles was knitting itself shut, proof of his enhanced regenerative ability. He planted his feet, steadying himself amid the swirling dust. Every muscle bristled with renewed vigor. With narrowed eyes, he met his foe's charge. The fight was only just beginning. Nethan had deliberately left the fortitude talent, his self-healing ability, inactive to conserve precious talent points. He just swept aside the three flying squirrels' assaults, shattering the sword chi they'd unleashed, and now he stood still, breath even, eyes flashing with renewed resolve. No longer on the defensive, he surged forward. This time, when he activated his distortion power, it wasn't gravity he twisted, but light and sound. A pulse of warped energy rippled from him, and in an instant the world within 50 meters went black. Every ray of light was sucked away, plunging the area into absolute darkness. At the same moment, a high-pitched, insect-like roar filled the air, like the unending chirr of a million crickets. The flying squirrels and Doberman reeled, blind and ears ringing. What is this?" one of the squirrels whimpered, flailing in the pitch-black void. Even the sailors who had fallen back to safer ground gaped in shock at the sudden dome of darkness that had claimed nearly the entire battlefield. None could tell what had happened, only that Nethan's powers had just taken on a terrifying new form. Inside the pitch-black cage, an invisible barrier extending 50 meters in every direction, the three transformed flying squirrels froze. Total darkness muzzled their eyes and ears. Beset by the unpredictable shifts in Nethan's power, they forced themselves to calm down. Drawing upon their dominance aura, they reached out with that single sense to pinpoint his every movement. But relying on dominance alone was tricky. Each squirrel had to track not only Nethan, but also the other two, or their teamwork would collapse. Even united, they found it hard to coordinate perfectly in this soundless, sightless void. Meanwhile, Nethan moved like a fish in water. Unfettered by the dark, he struck with silent precision. Where moments before three foes had huddled together, now shockwaves erupted as if he'd trapped them within his own encirclement. From the outside, it looked as though the squirrels had banded against him, but in truth, Nethan held every strand of the battle in his hands. Boom, boom. When Flying Squirrel and the others failed to intervene in time, Mozambia took two solid punches from Rhodes in quick succession. His arm went numb, and he staggered back, positioning himself between Flying Squirrel and Doberman as best he could. Seizing the moment, Rhodes cleared his throat in the darkness, reached for the hilt of the famed sword Chun-Li at his waist, drew it with a whisper of steel, and swung in one brutal arc. "Watch out!" Flying Squirrel shouted, having sensed Nethin's sudden blade leap toward them. But his warning vanished into the night air, drowned out by the relentless chorus of crickets. Neither Doberman nor Mozambia heard him. Fortunately, both of them possessed the rare technique known as overbearing presence, the uncanny ability to perceive an opponent's next move. In that instant, they felt Nethin drawing his own sword at their backs. It gave them only the barest fraction of a second to react, but in pitch-black darkness, even that sliver of awareness was precious. Overbearing presence, however powerful, can never truly replace sight or hearing. It merely detects intent, a hint of motion before it happens. Without clairvoyance, no one here could see the cut of a blade or hear a whisper in the dark. And though Doberman, Mozambia, and Flying Squirrel all wielded versions of the technique, each one was subtly different enough that predicting exactly how the others would move was all but impossible. Nethin's sonic blast ripped away their sight and hearing in an instant, leaving Flying Squirrel, Doberman, and Mozambia groping through impenetrable darkness. Each of them had a distinct strength: Flying Squirrel's raw intimidation and brute force, Doberman's precise weapon mastery, Mozambia's extraordinary hearing and vision, but without senses to guide them, those talents counted for nothing. Their limbs moved sluggishly, every strike held back by the fear that a misdirected blow might be twisted by Rhodes and wound a comrade instead. Then clang! Metal rang against metal, though no one could tell whose blade met whose. In the pitch-black void, they relied on nothing but stubborn pride. Nethin himself was no swordsman. He drew his blade not to land a killing blow, but simply to fan the chaos. A flash of energy stabbed through the gloom. Doberman's sword energy whipped toward Flying Squirrel's back. The blur of movement was almost too late. He tumbled aside, heart hammering, cheeks burning with humiliation. He sprang back up and punched out of instinct, sending Doberman reeling and nearly tossing his own sword from his grip. They froze. If this continued, they'd bleed each other dry before Rhodes ever struck. Panting in the silence, Nethin and his allies realized the truth no one dared voice until now. They had to put aside their pride and fight as one. Mozambia's heart tightened with anxiety, but in the chaos, neither Doberman nor the Flying Squirrel could hear his warning. Stranded and unable to communicate, they failed to lock shields back to back as he'd planned. Seizing the confusion, Nethin darted between them, exploiting every opening. In moments, the three defenders, separated and disoriented, found themselves overwhelmed by Nethin's relentless onslaught. Chapter 118, Talent and Toughness, Part 5. Nethin's ability couldn't actually damage their eyes or ears, or so the Flying Squirrel told himself as he forced his racing heart to calm down and retreated. Moments later, the ringing in his ears vanished, his vision snapped back into focus, and he realized he'd stepped out of the dark cage's influence. It really was just a matter of range. A triumphant glint flashed in his eyes. As the squirrel pulled back, Doberman and Mozambia shook off the disorientation and fell back too. All three of them believed they'd broken free, only to find the dark cage shifting with Nethin, remaining locked onto him no matter how far they ran. To engage Nethin, they'd have to cross back into that shadowy field. And with Nethin's speed outmatching theirs, scattering in three directions was pointless. He could simply chase down one opponent, deal with them, and then turn to the next. They were still at a tactical disadvantage. Nethin watched as Doberman, Flying Squirrel, and Mozambique slipped into their horn defense formation. Years of relentless skirmishing had sharpened Doberman and Flying Squirrel's coordination, but Rhodes refused to let them organize. He darted in from every side, crashing into their ranks with bone-shaking force. Boom, boom, boom. Each thunderous impact rattled the ground, and dozens of naval veterans looked on in stunned silence as arcs of blade energy ripped earth and sky apart. No one could say how long it went on. Bit by bit, the dark cage Nethin had summoned began to waver and then collapsed, unveiling the fighters within. Doberman, Flying Squirrel, and Mozambique planted their feet, horns locked, bracing for Rhodes's next strike. Nethan, chest heaving, had exhausted the last of his strength. He let the barrier drop without a fight. Now all four stood gasping for air. Rhodes's uniform hung in tatters, a jagged 10-centimeter slash across his left shoulder bleeding freely, turning his shirt a vivid crimson. Drops of blood splattered from his clenched fists, grotesque to see but nowhere near enough to take him down. Nethan looked surprisingly fresh compared to his three opponents, the Doberman brothers, who staggered back in worse shape than he'd ever been. The first, nicknamed the Flying Squirrel, scowled at Nethan. His left arm hung uselessly by his side, quivering as though every nerve had been shattered. "How's it going?" Nethan asked calmly. Mozambique, his second adversary, lifted his right arm. Blood oozed through torn flesh, bone fragments jutting out like cruel spikes. He shook his head. "Can't even lift my blade. My sword arm's gone, for now at least." A harsh cough ripped from the third brother's chest. He spat blood onto his tattered tunic, staining it with dark, sticky pools. None of them had expected to be battered so thoroughly. Nethan's own wounds, cuts and bruises, were light by comparison. Through clenched teeth, the wounded Doberman glared at Nethan, fury burning in his eyes. Inside that strange, shadowy cage where they'd fought, each of his attacks had felt stifled, funneled into frantic defenses and feeble counters. Though they had outnumbered Nethan 3-1, he'd robbed them of every ounce of initiative. Now they stood broken, forced into retreat by a single opponent. And yet, as the flickering torchlight played across their twisted expressions, it was clear the fight was far from over. Determination flickered in their wounded eyes. This setback would only make their next battle all the more fierce. Nethan's mastery of combat was undeniable, but his strength was on the verge of collapse. Flying Squirrel glared at him, lips curled in contempt. "He's a devil fruit user," he spat. "Maintaining that power must drain him completely. Don't give him a moment's rest." Mozambia drew a steadying breath and gave a curt nod. He leveled a chilling stare at Nethan, tightened his grip on the sword, and then, with a fierce battle cry, slashed toward him. At the same instant, Flying Squirrel and Doberman roared as they charged in from the left and right. As veteran lieutenant generals of the Navy, their coordination was flawless, each movement honed by countless engagements at sea. True, they bore fresh wounds, but none were as depleted as Nethan. If this had been a mere pirate crew, they'd have long since fled. But backed by the full might of their government and the fleet's command, these officers would not relent until victory was assured. Faced with the three-pronged assault, Nethan didn't call upon his dark cage ability. Instead, he wove the very gravity around him into a shimmering distortion, bending the battlefield itself to slip past their blades and evade the frontal onslaught. Nethan hung in midair, eyes locked on the charging Flying Squirrel. The bandit's gaze glittered with predatory focus as he drew a slow breath. "Flow like water. Cut off the stream," he hissed. His left arm quivered, his right hand clenched the hilt. A ribbon of cerulean light snaked along the blade, coalescing at its tip, before surging toward Nethan like a streaking comet. Without missing a heartbeat, Nethan swept his own sword in a wide arc. His blade cleaved the azure beam in two, sending shards of energy exploding into the night sky. Then, riding the momentum of his slash, he lunged forward, his fist crashing squarely against Flying Squirrel's sword tip. The impact rattled the bandit's grip, jerking the blade off course. Desperate to regain control, Flying Squirrel flipped high into the air. Mid-flip, he unleashed a rapid four-kick flurry, each strike aimed to pin Nethan in place. At the same moment, he rammed the flat of his sword into Nethan's chest, hoping to bury him under a combination of steel and chi. Nethan's face remained calm. He pressed his open hand against the sword's edge, letting the rushing sword chi slide harmlessly past him, as if striking an invisible wall. Then, in one seamless motion, he retracted his arm and delivered a thunderous right hook that shattered the airborne kicks, dispersing them in a cascade of blue sparks. He followed up by driving his palm into the hilt, wrenching the sword aside and forcing Flying Squirrel off balance. Before either man could recover, a new figure burst into the clearing, Doberman. His eyes burned with deadly intent as he charged, blade raised high, determined to finish Nethan here and now. Many onlookers in the naval fleet watched the unfolding battle with hearts pounding like storm-tossed seas. All three of the lieutenants were down, wounded and struggling, and even Rhodes, the ghost hand, bore fresh injuries. As a superhuman devil fruit user, each time Rhodes unleashed his power, his physical reserves drained even further. To the fleet's officers, it looked as though he might collapse at any moment. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some officers exchanged worried glances. Others drew their sidearms and steadied their voices as they called in reinforcements. Through hidden comlinks, they summoned the nearest major generals, begging them to hurry to the front lines and support the faltering lieutenants. On the field, Rhodes was pinned under the unrelenting onslaught of Doberman and his merciless cronies. A deep slash across his shoulder hampered his movements. And every effort to fight back seemed to cost him more strength than he could spare. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead as he dodged another brutal blow, the world around him spinning with exhaustion and danger. Despite the chaos, one figure remained steady, Nethan. He inhaled deeply, his chest rising in a measured breath. His eyes glinted with determination, the storm inside him settling into razor-sharp focus. The three lieutenants might be at their breaking point, and Rhodes was barely holding on, but Nethan had not yet made his move. Now, with the enemy pressing in and reinforcements still moments away, he readied himself for what came next. I'd been reluctant to spend my free talent points, but if I wanted to outshine the three lieutenant generals, my strength and endurance still weren't enough. Wham! I met the charging flying squirrel head-on, smashing it aside with a single punch. Determination flashed in my eyes as I gathered my focus and summoned the talent system. System. Activate general talent. Toughness. At once, a surge of raw power coursed through my veins, bolstering my muscles and hardening my resolve. I could feel my body growing stronger, more resilient, ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 119, Fiasco. Part 6. Nethan waved his hand, and a translucent interface materialized before him, automatically switching to the general talent tree. Focusing his thoughts, he navigated to the physical enhancements branch and activated the toughness node. Then he spent the 40 talent points he'd gained from slaying Bartra. A warm current surged from his chest, coursing through every fiber of his body. The muscles that had turned weary and sore from overexertion snapped back with renewed vigor. The bleeding gash on his shoulder knit closed at an accelerated pace, and the scab on his fist peeled away, only to mend itself instantly. Boom! Rhodes roared, his exhaustion forgotten in an instant. Clenching his left fist, he slammed it into the edge of Doberman's incoming sword strike. The collision rocked Doberman off his feet and sent him tumbling end over end. Caught wholly by surprise, the overextended mercenary could only scream as he crashed to the ground, his arm tingling with numbness from the sheer force of the blow. Doberman lay there, momentarily stunned, as Nethan and Rhodes pressed their advantage. The battle, once teetering on the brink of disaster, had swung back in their favor in a single, decisive moment. Nethan's eyes flicked open just as Mozambique shouted, "He's gathering everything he's got for one last desperate strike. Don't let him break free." Mozambique, Rhodes, and Doberman, accompanied, oddly enough, by their trained flying squirrel scout, exchanged a quick glance. In unison, they braced themselves and unleashed their deadliest arsenal, leaving Nethan no margin for escape. Inside Nethan's chest, the roaring heat that had fueled his extraordinary healing was finally ebbing away. He felt the cost in his muscles and bones. Every ounce of raw strength drained to patch his wounds. Yet thanks to his iron will and unyielding constitution, he could overload his distortion powers without fear of permanent harm. Even in this battered state, he remained unbroken. The trio's assault came in an instant, a barrage of energy blasts converging on him from three sides. But instead of cowering, Nethan drew a jagged breath, a feral grin spreading across his face. The pain in his limbs only sharpened his focus. He locked eyes with each attacker, and then, deep in his core, he summoned the last vestiges of his twisted power. "This is not my last struggle," he murmured, voice low and fierce. "This is the final reckoning." With a roar that cracked the very air, he unleashed it. Boom, boom, boom. 3 thunderous detonations ripped through the battlefield, marking the eruption of Nethan's ultimate fist of distortion, and sealing the fate of everyone who dared stand against him. Nethan unleashed the twisted power of his overload in a single, devastating blow. He thrust his fists forward, slamming Doberman and the flying squirrel off their feet, then followed through with a sweeping kick that sent Mozambia hurtling backward. "Dark Prison! Meteorite Array!" he roared. In an instant, the two techniques merged. The Dark Prison's inky void snapped shut around a 60 to 70-meter radius, while the Meteorite Array shattered the earth itself, hurling sand, gravel, and boulders skyward. Inside the suffocating darkness, the ground split and crumbled, sending rock fragments crashing together like meteors in the night sky. Doberman's eyes widened in shock. He lunged blindly through the gloom, sword slashing in a desperate counterattack. But Nethin's fist met steel with a thunderous crack. The force of the blow sent Doberman flying backward, right between two massive boulders, each over 10 meters across. With a bone-shaking crunch, the stones collided, spraying rock and dust in every direction. Spitting out a mouthful of blood, Doberman slumped against the scattered debris, crimson stains blooming across the shattered rock. Knowing Doberman was in peril, the flying squirrel and Mozambia let out anguished cries and sprang to his aid. The squirrel's charge was halted by a storm of levitating stone. It hacked at them with its sword to carve a path. Mozambia hurled himself into the darkness alone. Rhodes, however, simply watched with cold indifference. The dark cage's restraints held everyone else, but not him. This was his own creation, and he was immune to its power. Mozambia's battle cry vanished in the void. Then came the crack of shattering steel. With a roar like exploding thunder, Mozambia was flung backwards. Nethin's grip had twisted the warrior's sword until it snapped in two, the broken halves clattering to the ground. Of the three allies, Mozambia suffered the most grievously. His right arm lay half destroyed. In his weakened left hand, the ruined blade weighed like a feather. He had lost at least 30 to 40% of his strength. Facing Rhodes now, he could barely muster a defense. At best, he might pin Rhodes down for an instant, but any attempt to charge would be suicide. Impossible. How could Nethin, drained nearly to exhaustion, still unleash such power? Mozambia hurtled through the air, his form contorted by shock and disbelief. It was simply beyond reason. Nethin's power was beyond anything they had ever seen, and yet the proof stood before their eyes. He had been flung outward by the explosion, sent crashing into the jagged stones like a helpless insect under a hammer. Boulders tumbled over him in an unrelenting avalanche, and when the dust finally settled, his lifeblood sprayed across the gravel, turning each stone a gruesome shade of red. Every sailor on deck fell silent at the sheer ferocity of that burst of energy. No one dared breathe. Had it ended? Or was there more to come? At that moment, Admiral Stolleberg and Major General André Duclos arrived, their black capes whipping in the wind. Headquarters had dispatched 6 major generals for this mission, 3 to pursue Robin Lafitte's faction, and 3 to stand ready for whatever crisis might emerge. One of Duclos's cadre remained behind to guard the ship, and now the remaining 2 officers rushed forward to witness the aftermath. Stolleberg narrowed his eyes at the flickering shadows where Nethin had vanished, as if staring into a living black prison. "What was that?" he demanded. Colonel Hayes, the senior naval officer at hand, shook himself out of his stunned daze and fell into a crisp military salute. "Sir, the target, named Nethin, employed a field that nullified both sound and sight within its radius. Our entire advance was blind and deaf to his movements. Then he erupted in that detonation." Stolleberg inhaled, his face hard as flint. A cloaking barrier that scrambles perception. He's not just powerful, he's tactical genius. Report to headquarters immediately. We need full reconnaissance before we make our next move. As Hayes sprinted to relay the orders, Stolleberg turned back to the silent chaos of splintered rock and blood-stained gravel. Somewhere in that darkness, Nethin waited, unseen, unheard, and more dangerous than ever. Nethin stood among the assembled sailors as the naval officer beside him finished his report. Stolleberg gave a curt nod, his gaze fixed on the dark cage at the center of the field. He could only shake his head, a wry smile flickering across his lips. This entire fiasco had started with the order he delivered for Doberman, and now here they were, knee-deep in consequences. At least it was finally coming to a head. With all 3 lieutenant generals trapped on the island, escape was virtually impossible. Then, without warning, the cage's ominous thrum stilled. Its dim glow winked out, and shadows retreated, unveiling the terrain beneath. Major General Muya inhaled slowly, his expression as unreadable as ever, while the others watched the light fade away. But relief was shattered in an instant. Faces went pale as every man there registered the devastation spread before them. The ground lay in ruins, cracked and heaved as though some colossal plow had churned it repeatedly, and there, amid the rubble, lay Mozambique's body. His arms splayed at odd angles, eyes frozen wide in a wordless mix of shock and disbelief. Silence fell over the clearing. Nethan felt the weight of it press in from all sides. This was no simple victory. It was the grim aftermath of the power they'd unleashed, and the proof that some orders, once given, could never be taken back. Doberman and the flying squirrel lay sprawled on opposite sides of the clearing. The squirrel leaned heavily on his sword, barely upright, his breath ragged and wet with blood at the corner of his mouth. Across from him, Doberman pressed his back against a jagged rock, his chest caved in, every inhale a torture. No, I can't accept this, he thought, fury burning in his veins. I never wanted to be a pirate. Nethan forced me into this life. The words his subordinate had repeated to him rang like a curse, but in his mind they took on Nethan's own cold voice. I don't want to be a pirate. You forced me to be a pirate. And there in his memory stood Nethan on the West Sea deck, drenched in blood and surrounded by shattered bones, delivering those words without so much as a flicker of remorse. He, of all people, decides the future of these waters? Ha! What a joke! Doberman coughed violently, eyes blazing with anger, regret, and a deep, bitter unwillingness to yield. He let out a hoarse, seething roar. You have no faith, no justice, all your strength. It's nothing but chance. General Stolberg sneered. A mere pirate steering the future of these seas? Don't make me laugh. Battered and breathless, Nethan forced himself upright, each inhale a ragged reminder of how close he'd come to collapse. He cast a quick glance at Stolberg and Major General Muya advancing through the wreckage, then looked back at Doberman's unconscious form. Calm, unmoved. At least today, you didn't let me fall, he thought, drawing on every scrap of strength he had left. With a low hum of power, Nethan twisted gravity itself around his body. The ground slipped away beneath him as he rose, tracing a graceful arc against the darkening sky. In an instant, he was gone, shot off toward the horizon like a streak of silver. For a long moment, Stolberg and Muya stood frozen, hands tight on their sword hilts but too stunned to act. Below them, the lone flying squirrel, Nethan's faithful companion, panted heavily, its small chest heaving. We have to stop him, the squirrel gasped, its voice strained. Muya's fists clenched. Then I'll chase him down. I won't let him get away. Stolberg cut him off with a sharp no. His gray eyes were hard as steel in the fading light. We do not pursue recklessly. If he wants to carve his own path, we'll let him. For now. Muya hesitated, torn between duty and loyalty, as the last glimmer of Nathan's silhouette vanished into the night. The wind whispered through the battlefield, bearing away any hope of stopping the pirate who dreamed of ruling the seas. Nethan sank onto an upturned crate, every muscle trembling from the effort of holding himself up. He turned to Muya, his expression darkening. We lost our best opening back there, he said quietly, shaking his head. Chasing them now won't change a thing. His voice broke as he coughed fiercely, clutching his side. When he could speak again, he glanced at Mozambique's lifeless body and then at Doberman, who lay gravely wounded. We have our orders. Fall back. Muya stared at him, disbelief etched across her face. Lieutenant General Nethan. He cut her off with another weary shake of the head. No, a forced attack would only cost us more lives and still leave Ghost Hand Roads undefeated. This encirclement was bound to fail. It's already a complete disaster. In June of the 13th year of the Great Pirate Era, the headquarters fleet, commanded by 3 lieutenant generals, engaged the notorious Ghost Hand pirates off Spring Island. The battle ended in catastrophe. Mozambique was slain, our ships lay in ruins, and the fleet was driven from the field. When the news of this defeat reached the wider world, it sent shockwaves through every corner of the seas. Chapter 120, Retreat Order, 7th. Nethan's chest heaved as he stumbled away from the battlefield, his vision blurred by fatigue. He'd just broken contact alongside Doberman and Flying Squirrel, both freshly minted lieutenant generals, and despite the rush of adrenaline, his body was spent. He collapsed onto the sandy shore with a grunt, the grains biting into his uniform. His damaged shoulder and knuckles had knitted back together, the scabs long since shed, but every muscle screamed in protest. Sweat peppered his brow, the aftermath of pushing himself far beyond his limits. He took a moment to gather his strength and survey the horizon. Facing even one veteran lieutenant general 9 years his senior would be a daunting task. Facing 3 simultaneously was outright suicidal. Doberman and Flying Squirrel had courage in spades, but their raw power still lagged behind the headquarters' long service officers. Even with Rhodes vouching for Nethin's famed toughness, the odds of victory, let alone survival, were vanishingly small. Nethin wondered whether what they'd just done counted as a triumph over the Navy, or simply a narrow escape. Steeling himself, he rose to his feet. Each step was agony, but he couldn't afford to linger. The ghost shadow waited offshore, its dark hull bobbing on the waves like a silent promise of safety. Nethin forced a grim smile. Tonight, the retreat would hold, and tomorrow they would fight again. With a final glance back at the scorched remains of the battlefield, he limped toward the water's edge, ready to vanish into the night. Nethin staggered back, every muscle screaming from the brutal fight he'd just endured against the Flying Squirrel and his lieutenants. His toughness talent had bolstered his strength, but only just enough to keep him standing. Had he not tapped into that reserve power, he wouldn't even have registered the 2 major generals from headquarters closing in, then immediately pulling back. As division-level officers, they still had the authority to break up a duel between him and a lieutenant general. He'd thrown absolutely everything he had into this battle to force a victory. If the Flying Squirrels had managed to summon those 2 generals any earlier, if the reinforcements had arrived just a heartbeat sooner, the tide of combat could easily have turned against him. Fortunately, Nethin's gravity distortion ability, coupled with reflexes that outpaced his 3 adversaries, granted him a guaranteed escape route. The instant defeat seemed inevitable. None of the lieutenants could intercept a man who could quite literally fly away. As for activating his tenacity talent, that option had been on the table for some time. He'd weighed the cost and benefits more than once, but ultimately decided to hold it in reserve, up until this very moment, the moment he needed it most. Nethin felt an unfamiliar surge of power ripple through his limbs. In the hierarchy of the general system's talents, physical enhancement was a broad upgrade to bodily prowess, and toughness was one of its specialized branches. Compared with pure strength augmentation, toughness not only bolstered his raw power, but also accelerated his recovery rate, allowing him to push beyond his limits at the cost of hidden injuries. He glanced around, expecting the usual fanfare of a system notification. Naval forces defeated, reward granted, but heard only the crash of waves against the shore. Shaking his head, he drew in a deep breath as the newfound vitality coursed through him, sealing bruises and mending atoms. The ghost's shadow lay half buried in the sand, its prow angled toward the open sea. Scattered around the hull, dozens of naval troops lay motionless or crumpled against the dunes, casualties of the fierce engagement. Beyond them, 3 of the fleet admirals, flanked by their elite guards, were locked in desperate combat with Lafitte and his core crew. Though the Navy had clearly suffered grievous losses, the tide of battle was turning against the privateers. Nethin straightened his shoulders. With his toughness awakened, he'd be the pivot to flip this fight, and he had every intention of doing just that. Chapter 8. Clash with the Headquarters Elite. The Navy troops surged forward at the general's signal, only to be cut down in droves. They had underestimated the 3 major generals sent from headquarters, seasoned veterans who were anything but pushovers. On one flank, Lafitte weaved through cannon blasts, his footsteps barely touching the deck as he closed in on the 1st Major General. Steel rang against steel as they traded blows. Whenever the general pressed too hard, Lafitte dropped low and fired precise shots from his pistol, each bullet thundering past to bolster Nico Robin's defenses just yards away. Robin squared off against the 2nd Major General, whose expertise lay not in swordsmanship, but in raw, overwhelming strength and rokushiki martial arts. His muscles bulged with each stance. He was no direct threat to Robin's devil fruit abilities, yet every punch and kick still rattled the very ground they stood on. In response, Robin sprouted extra arms, intercepting his crushing strikes and trying desperately to find an opening. Even so, the general's six-style techniques loomed large, each impact threatening to shatter bone and sinew alike. Meanwhile, Trafalgar Law and Sirius had cornered the third major general on the opposite side of the deck. They hadn't reckoned with the arrival of Xilu, the brawny Sky Island sailor whom Nithan had recently recruited. Towering and broad-shouldered, Xilu swung his great axe with brutal elegance. Empowered by Nethan's augmenting ability, he met the general's onslaught head-on, his axe clanging against iron-hard defenses and forcing the enemy to retreat step by step. But the Major General was not to be outdone. Drawing a deep breath, he activated a new Rokushiki form, a ripple of power radiating outward in shockwaves. Even Shilu's reinforced strength buckled beneath that devastating force, and for a fleeting moment, it looked as if the headquarters elite might break through their lines. The roar of battle swallowed the island's roar of wind, and every fighter on deck knew one truth: the conflict was far from decided. With each passing second, the balance of power could tip in favor of either side, and the next move would prove decisive. Nethan was still too young, hardly seasoned enough for a direct confrontation. He sucked in a lungful of air, sweat beading on his brow. Forcing himself calm, he flicked his wrist and activated his Devil Fruit's surgical power. In an instant, he swapped the Admiral's position with a patch of sand beside Shilu. The Admiral's strike went wide, carrying him straight into the path of Shilu's sweeping axe. Clang! Metal rang out as the Admiral's blade slammed against the axe. He staggered, eyes flashing coldly, then unleashed a wave of sword energy aimed at Nethan. The arc of force carved a 10-meter gash across the beach. Without hesitating, Nethan triggered his power again, phasing out of the attack's path. Yet each use drained him further, and his sweat-soaked forehead reminded him that this prolonged duel only favored their enemy. He cast a grim glance over the battlefield. Robin and the others were locked in a desperate struggle, and only Lafayette's sporadic interventions had kept them from being overrun. If Lafayette committed fully to the fight, defeat would be all but certain. Lafitte found himself unable to put down the headquarters Major General as quickly as he'd hoped. Every move he made felt harder than the last, and Nithan knew Rhodes faced even greater peril. What had once seemed like a simple matter of evading a few bounty hunters had escalated into a full-scale battle against the Navy's top brass. 3 headquarters Major Generals now pressed their assault. Their blows rained down on Robin and the others, forcing them onto the defensive. Only Lafitte, with his surgical fruit ability, could still offer support, but even his talents weren't enough to handle 3 Major Generals at once. Then, just as the tide was turning decisively against them, the Major General pinning Robin froze mid-swing. The sound of a small device buzzing in his pocket cut through the chaos. Frowning in annoyance, he paused, his fists suspended in mid-air, as he reached inside to retrieve the unexpected interruption. Nethan didn't even have to fish the bugged earpiece out of his pocket. He simply slipped his finger inside, tapped the hidden transmitter, and tuned in. "Major General John, how's the battle progressing? It should be wrapping up soon," came the crackling voice of his superior. John's deep reply buzzed through just as he landed a swift kick against Robin's side. "Not yet," he growled. A tense silence followed, then the superior's voice dropped to a hushed, almost defeated tone. "It's not over yet?" But only for an instant. Suddenly his voice snapped back into sharp focus. "Lieutenant General Flying Squirrel issues new orders. Everyone withdraw immediately." John froze, the bug's message still echoing in his ear. Around him, both Robin and Lafitte stiffened. Lafitte blinked in surprise, a crooked smile flickering across his lips, while Robin, who had been bracing herself, visibly relaxed. John and the 2 other Major Generals exchanged stunned looks. Defeating the Ghost Hand pirates had been within their grasp. Why pull back now? Could this really be the Flying Squirrel's command?